15 of America's deadliest snipers had already failed. A captured intelligence officer knelt in the snow with a blade pressed to his throat, and a warlord's live-stream camera broadcast every second to the world. Wind shredded every bullet before it reached the target. Then a 26-year-old woman, a logistics clerk nobody had even bothered to learn the name of, stepped forward and asked for the rifle. They laughed at her. They told her to sit down. But when she finally pulled the trigger, the bullet flew for 4 impossible seconds through frozen mountain air and changed everything anyone thought they knew about war. If this story grips you, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The Blackstone Highlands didn't forgive mistakes. Sergeant First Class Dominic Harlow had learned that the hard way over 19 years in uniform, and now the mountains were teaching the lesson again to every shooter on the ridge. Temperature had dropped to 14 below. Wind chill made it worse, somewhere around -30, though nobody was bothering to calculate comfort anymore. Comfort had stopped mattering 3 hours ago when the satellite feed confirmed what everyone feared. Victor Draven had a hostage, and he was going to kill him on camera. Harlow pressed his eye to the spotting scope and watched the compound below. It sat in a jagged cut between 2 granite walls, 1,300 meters across the valley floor, slightly below their elevation. A collection of concrete buildings, some with corrugated roofs weighted down by rocks, others open to the elements. The largest structure, an old mining office, had been turned into Draven's command post. 2 industrial floodlights poured yellow against the snow outside its entrance, and between those lights, a man knelt on frozen ground with his hands zip-tied behind his back and a black hood pulled over his face. Captain Nathan Voss, Defense Intelligence Agency, captured 11 days ago during an asset extraction that went sideways in the border region. Voss had been running networks in the Highlands for 2 years, feeding coordinates that led to 6 successful strikes against Draven's weapons depots. When Draven's people finally identified him, they didn't just grab him, they made a production out of it. The live stream had started 40 minutes ago. Harlow keyed his radio. Overwatch 1, this is Ridge Actual. I need a wind read south face. The response came clipped and frustrated. Ridge Actual, Overwatch 1. Wind at the midpoint is gusting 32 to 41 knots, direction inconsistent. We're getting rotational currents off the east wall. Every model I run gives me a different deflection. It's a mess down there. Harlow pulled back from the scope and looked at the man lying beside him. Staff Sergeant Kyle Braddock, one of the top 5 competitive long-range shooters in the entire military, was flat on his belly behind a custom bolt-action chambered in .338 Lapua Magnum. Braddock's face was pressed against the cheek rest, his right eye locked into the scope, his gloved finger resting along the trigger guard. He hadn't moved in 4 minutes. Kyle, I heard him. Braddock's voice was barely audible. I put 3 rounds downrange in the last 20 minutes, and every one of them hit rock. The wind isn't just crossing, it's layering. There's a ground current moving left to right, a mid-valley thermal pushing upward, and then something at altitude pulling everything east. I can compensate for 2 of the 3, not all of them at once. Can you make the shot? Braddock didn't answer immediately. That alone told Harlow everything. I can try again. Trying isn't going to cut it. Draven's people heard the last impact. They know someone's shooting. If we miss again, they'll move Voss inside and we'll never get another window. Then what do you want me to do, Dom? Bend the goddamn wind? Harlow didn't respond. He turned his head and looked down the ridge where 11 other sniper teams were spread across the rock face, each paired with a spotter, each running their own calculations, each failing. 12 of the best shooters in the United States military, some borrowed from JSOC, some from the 75th Ranger Regiment, 2 from a unit whose designation didn't officially exist, and not one of them could solve the problem the valley was throwing at them. 1,300 meters wasn't even remarkable distance for these men. On a flat range, most of them could put rounds into a dinner plate at 1,500. Some had confirmed kills beyond 2,000. But the Blackstone Highlands didn't offer flat ranges. The valley created a wind tunnel with chaotic thermal layers that shifted every 90 seconds. And the granite walls bounced currents back on themselves in patterns that defied every ballistic model the teams carried. 15 shots had been fired since the operation began. 15 misses. And time was running out. Down in the compound, Victor Draven stepped in front of the camera. He was a tall man, thickly built, wearing a military jacket over a wool sweater. His beard was streaked with gray, and his eyes had the dead calm of someone who had stopped feeling consequences a long time ago. He grabbed the hood on the hostage's head and yanked it off. Captain Nathan Voss blinked against the floodlights. His face was swollen, one eye nearly shut, dried blood crusted along his jaw. He didn't make a sound. Even on his knees, even beaten half to death, Voss held himself with a rigidity that came from training so deep it had become reflex. Draven said something to the camera in his native tongue, then switched to broken English, his performance language, the one meant for the international audience he knew was watching. "Your government sends spies," Draven said, gripping Voss by the hair. "Your soldiers shoot at me from the mountains and miss. Every bullet that misses, I take a piece of this man." He drew a combat knife from his belt and held it near Voss's face. "You have 15 minutes. Then the world watches him die." On the ridge, the satellite relay fed Draven's words through every team's earpiece with a 4-second delay. Harlow's stomach dropped. 15 minutes, he said quietly. Braddock closed his eyes behind the scope. "I'm telling you, Dom, the wind is unsolvable at this distance with this setup. We need closer positioning or air support." Air support was denied 2 hours ago. Political situation won't allow a strike package in this airspace. And there's no closer position that gives us line of sight. This ridge is it. Then we're out of options. No. Harlow stood up, ignoring the cold that hit him like a wall. We're out of the options we like. That's not the same thing. He started walking down the ridge. Specialist Ava Mercer heard the radio traffic from her position 60 meters behind the firing line. She wasn't supposed to be listening. Her job was logistics, weapon maintenance, ammunition management, equipment transport. She had been attached to this task force 3 months ago as a supply specialist, replacing a sergeant who had rotated home after a knee injury. Nobody had asked for her specifically. The personnel office had simply matched an open slot with an available body, and Ava happened to be the available body. In 3 months, she had spoken fewer words to the sniper teams than most people spoke before breakfast. She maintained their rifles, organized their ammunition by lot number and manufacturing date, tracked barrel round counts, and made sure every optic was zeroed according to each shooter's preference card. She was efficient, thorough, and completely invisible. That was fine with her. Ava sat cross-legged on a foam pad behind a low rock wall, her back against a supply crate, a battered notebook open on her knee. She wore the same cold weather gear as everyone else: layered base, insulated shell, white oversmock for the snow environment. But on her small frame, it looked borrowed. At 5'4" and 118 pounds, she disappeared inside equipment designed for men twice her size. She had been writing in the notebook for the last 40 minutes. Not personal thoughts, not letters home. Numbers. Columns of numbers, each row representing a shot she had heard fired from the ridge. Beside each row, she had noted the time, the wind direction she estimated from watching snowdrift patterns, the approximate holdover she guessed each shooter had used based on her knowledge of their rifle setups, and the result: miss left, miss right, miss high. 15 rows, 15 misses. But Ava wasn't looking at the misses. She was looking at the pattern. Every shooter on the ridge was treating the wind as a single variable, a crosswind with a speed and a direction that they tried to compensate for with a horizontal holdover. Some of the better ones were accounting for vertical thermals, adding or subtracting elevation clicks to adjust for rising or falling air currents. But all of them were treating each wind layer independently, calculating separate corrections and then stacking them. Ava saw something different. The 3 wind layers, ground crosswind, mid-valley thermal, high-altitude shear, weren't independent. They were interacting. Where the ground current met the thermal, it created a rotational eddy that spun the bullet off axis. Where the thermal met the high shear, it accelerated the bullet's drift in a direction none of the shooters were compensating for because it didn't exist in any standard wind model. The wind wasn't 3 separate problems. It was one system. And Ava had been studying systems like this since she was 9 years old. Her grandfather, Elias Mercer, had been a different kind of shooter, not military. Never military. Elias had been a competitive long-range rifle shooter who spent 40 years traveling to matches across the western states, shooting a distance that made military snipers uncomfortable. He had won national titles in disciplines most people didn't know existed. Extreme long-range bench rest, ELR field competitions where targets sat at a mile or more, precision rifle series events held in mountain terrain where wind was the only enemy that mattered. Elias didn't believe in ballistic computers. He didn't believe in wind meters or environmental sensors or any of the technology that modern competitive shooting had embraced. He believed in reading the wind with his eyes, his skin, and his instinct, an instinct built over decades of watching mirage patterns, grass movement, dust behavior, and snowdrift. He had taught Ava everything. Starting at age 9, she had accompanied him to every match, every practice session, every windy hillside where he set up targets and made her watch before he ever let her touch a rifle. By 12, she could read a crosswind within 2 miles per hour just by watching the way heat shimmer bent above the ground. By 15, she was shooting in junior divisions under her middle name, Grace, because Elias didn't want anyone connecting his granddaughter to his reputation. He wanted her results to stand on their own. They did. By 19, she had won 3 national junior ELR titles. By 21, she was placing in open divisions against shooters with 30 years of experience. She understood wind in a way that most people understood music, not as theory, but as feel, something she processed below the level of conscious thought. Then she had enlisted, not because she wanted to be a sniper, not because she wanted glory or combat or any of the things recruiting posters promised. She enlisted because Elias was diagnosed with early-stage cognitive decline, and the medical bills overwhelmed his savings, and the military offered health care benefits that extended to dependent family members if the paperwork was filed correctly. Ava filed the paperwork, passed basic training near the top of her class, and was assigned to a logistics MOS that had nothing to do with rifles. She never told anyone about the competitions. She never told anyone about Elias. She simply maintained weapons for people who never asked who was maintaining them, and she watched the wind every chance she got. Sergeant First Class Harlow walked down the ridge with a heaviness that had nothing to do with the altitude. 15 misses, 15 chances burned, and now a warlord with a camera and a knife was counting down the minutes until he murdered an American intelligence officer on a live stream that half the world's intelligence agencies were monitoring in real time. Harlow had commanded sniper teams for 9 years. He had been in rooms where decisions were made that ended lives and started wars, and he had never once felt this specific flavor of helplessness, the kind where every tool in his kit had been tried and found wanting. He stopped at Team 4's position. Sergeant First Class Rick Castellano was behind his rifle, his spotter whispering wind corrections that both of them knew were approximations at best. Rick, Castellano didn't look up. I've got a solution I'm about 60% confident in. 60%. That's the best I can give you. The wind changed twice while I was dialing. If you miss, they move him inside. No more shot. I know that, Dom. Then don't miss. Castellano's jaw tightened. You want to come down here and do the math yourself? Harlow stared at him for a long moment, then moved on. 3 positions later, he reached Team 7, 2 young sergeants from the 75th who had been attached to the task force as augments. The shooter, a kid named Torres, looked like he might throw up. Torres, talk to me. Sergeant, I've run every wind call I know, and none of them make sense. The mirage down in the valley is doing something I've never seen. It's like the air is folding over on itself. Your spotter? Torres glanced at his partner, Corporal Webb, who shook his head slowly. We've got nothing, Sergeant. Every calculation we run says the shot is possible, but the wind doesn't match the calculations. Something's wrong with the valley. Nothing was wrong with the valley. The valley was doing what valleys did in extreme cold at high altitude with complex terrain features, generating chaotic, layered wind systems that defied linear models. Harlow knew this intellectually, but knowing it didn't help him solve it. He was about to move on when a quiet voice reached him from behind a supply crate. Sergeant Harlow. He turned. The logistics specialist, the small one, the one whose name he had to think about for a second, was standing up from behind her rock wall holding a notebook. Mercer, he said, placing the name. What? I've been tracking every shot from the ridge, all 15. I think I know why they're missing. Harlow looked at her the way a surgeon might look at a janitor offering diagnosis mid-operation. Not with cruelty exactly, with the specific exhaustion of a man who didn't have time for things that weren't solutions. Mercer, I appreciate the initiative, but I've got 12 trained snipers running calculations right now, and they're treating the wind as three separate layers and compensating independently. That's why every correction overshoots or undershoots. The layers are interacting. The ground crosswind creates a rotational eddy where it meets the thermal uplift at around 400 meters. That eddy adds a corkscrew component to bullet drift that isn't captured in any standard wind model. If you compensate for the eddy as part of the thermal correction instead of treating them separately, the math works. Harlow stared at her. Torres and Webb stared at her. The wind howled across the ridge and nobody spoke for 5 full seconds. "How do you know that?" Harlow asked. "I've been watching the snowdrift patterns in the valley for 40 minutes. The drift shows you where the layers interact. You can see the eddy if you know what to look for." "You've been watching snow." "Yes, Sergeant. And from watching snow, you think you've solved a wind problem that a dozen of the best shooters in the military can't crack." "I don't think." "I know. The pattern is consistent. Every miss correlates with the eddy rotation. The shooters who corrected most aggressively for crosswind missed by the widest margin because their correction amplified the eddy effect. The shooters who held minimal crosswind missed by the smallest margin because they accidentally reduced the eddy's influence." Harlow's radio crackled. "Ridge actual, Overwatch 1, target, has resumed speaking to camera. He's holding the knife against the hostage's neck. Estimate 8 to 10 minutes before execution." 8 to 10 minutes. Harlow looked at Ava Mercer, really looked at her for the first time. Small, quiet, young, holding a notebook full of numbers with the calm expression of someone who had done arithmetic under pressure so many times it no longer registered as stress. "Even if you're right," Harlow said slowly, "knowing why they missed doesn't tell me how to hit. I can make the shot." The words landed like a grenade. Torres actually laughed, a short, nervous bark that he immediately tried to cover. Webb looked at the ground. Harlow's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted from tired dismissal to active evaluation. "You're a logistics specialist. I'm a competitive long-range shooter. I've been shooting since I was 9. I've placed nationally in extreme long-range competitions. I understand how to read complex wind systems because I was trained by someone who spent 40 years doing nothing else. Why isn't any of this in your service record?" "Because I enlisted as logistics and nobody ever asked." Harlow took a slow breath, the kind of breath a man takes when he's deciding between two terrible options and trying to figure out which one he can live with. "You've never fired in combat." "No." "You've never taken a shot where human life depended on the outcome." "No." "And you want me to hand you a rifle and let you take the most consequential shot any of us will ever see based on snowdrift patterns and a notebook full of numbers?" Ava met his eyes without flinching. "What I want doesn't matter, Sergeant. What matters is that in about 8 minutes, Captain Voss is going to die on camera unless someone makes a shot that none of your current shooters can make. I'm telling you I can solve the wind. You can believe me or not. Either way, that clock is running." Harlow turned away from her and keyed his radio. "All teams, Ridge Actual, status on firing solutions." The responses came back in rapid succession. Each one was a variation of the same answer. "No confidence, wind too unpredictable. Requesting alternative options." There were no alternative options. Harlow turned back to Ava. "If you miss, the hostage dies and it's on my conscience. You understand that? If nobody shoots, the hostage dies anyway." He stared at her for another 3 seconds. Then he unkeyed his radio and spoke to Torres. "Give her your rifle." Torres blinked. "Sergeant?" "I said give her the rifle." "You can't be—" "Torres, rifle, now." The word spread down the ridge in seconds. Staff Sergeant Braddock was the first to respond, keying his radio with barely contained disbelief. "Ridge Actual, Braddock. Did I just hear you're pulling Torres and giving his platform to the armorer?" "You heard correctly." "Dom, that's insane. She's a supply clerk. She's the only person on this ridge who can explain why 15 rounds missed. That puts her ahead of everyone else right now, including you. Explaining a miss and making a hit are two completely different things." "I'm aware. Clock's running, Kyle. You got a better idea? I'm listening." Silence. "That's what I thought." Ava moved to Torres's position with a controlled urgency that surprised Harlow. She didn't rush. She didn't fumble. She settled behind the rifle with the practiced fluidity of someone who had done this 10,000 times because she had. But the rifle was wrong. Torres was 6'1", 190 pounds. His length of pull, cheek weld height, and bipod positioning were all calibrated for a much larger frame. Ava's first 60 seconds were spent adjusting. She shortened the buttstock to its minimum setting, lowered the cheek piece 3 clicks, and repositioned the bipod legs to change the rifle's natural point of aim. Webb, still lying in the spotter position beside her, watched with growing unease. Specialist? You know this is a Remington MSR chambered in .338 Lapua, 26-inch barrel, 1 in 9.35 twist rate. Loopholed Mark V scope, 35 power max magnification. I maintain this rifle. I know it better than Torres does. Webb shut his mouth. Ava settled into position and pressed her eye to the scope. The compound leaped into focus. The floodlights, the kneeling hostage, the armed men moving between buildings. She could see Draven pacing in front of the camera, gesturing with the knife, performing for an audience that included intelligence agencies, news networks, and millions of anonymous viewers. She pulled back from the scope and opened her notebook. "What's our exact range?" she asked Webb. "Laser confirms 1,327 meters. Altitude differential? We're 93 meters above the target. Temperature? -14 Celsius at our position. Estimated -9 at target altitude. Barometric pressure?" Webb checked his Kestrel weather meter. 702 millibars. Ava wrote the numbers down, then did something none of the other shooters had done. She closed her notebook, set it aside, and stared at the valley with her naked eyes. Not through the scope, not through the spotting glass. With her eyes, she watched the snow. Not the snow on the ground, the snow in the air. Fine crystals of ice were being carried by the wind in patterns that told a story if you knew how to read it. Near the ground, the crystals moved left to right at a steady pace. At roughly 400 meters out, they began to swirl. The rotational eddy she had identified, the wind currents folding over each other like water in a river eddy. Above the eddy, the crystals accelerated and shifted direction. Carried by the high-altitude shear that bent everything eastward, Ava didn't just see the wind, she felt it. It was the thing Elias had spent years teaching her, the thing no ballistic computer could replicate. Wind wasn't a number on a meter. Wind was a living system, and if you watched it long enough, it showed you its rhythm. It had patterns, cycles, moments of relative calm between gusts where the layers briefly aligned before chaos resumed. She needed one of those moments. She needed 4 seconds of partial alignment, not perfect calm, because perfect calm didn't exist in this valley, but a window where the eddy weakened just enough for a bullet to pass through without being thrown off axis. She watched for 2 full minutes while the clock burned. Ridge actual, Overwatch 1. Target is becoming agitated. He's checking his watch. We're inside 6 minutes. Harlow's voice came back tight. "Mercer, tell me where we are." "I'm reading the wind cycle. There's a partial alignment every 90 to 100 seconds. I need to time the shot to hit the window." "You need to time a shot at 1,300 meters to hit a weather window you're identifying by watching snowflakes." "Yes," Braddock's voice cut in on the radio, not bothering with call signs. "This is lunacy. Harlow, pull her off the gun and let me try again. I'll hold minimal correction and... Kyle, your last round hit rock 15 meters left of target. Sit tight." Ava tuned out the radio chatter. She tuned out the cold biting through her gloves. She tuned out the knowledge that a man was going to die in minutes if she couldn't do what she had just promised. She tuned out everything except the wind. The snow crystals swirled, drifted, accelerated, and swirled again. She counted the seconds between each cycle. 92, 97, 89. The pattern wasn't metronomic, it varied with each rotation, but it was consistent enough to predict within a 10-second window. She began building her firing solution. Standard. Hold over for 1,327 meters at this altitude and temperature, 14.3 mils of elevation. She dialed the scope turret, counting clicks with her thumb. Windage correction for the ground crosswind, 2.1 mils right. But, and this was the part no one else had solved, she needed to subtract 0.6 mils from that correction to account for the eddy's rotational influence during the alignment window. The eddy wouldn't disappear during the window. It would weaken. That weakening would reduce the bullet's lateral drift by roughly 40% compared to what the shooters had been compensating for. The net holdover was lower than what anyone on the ridge had tried, which meant her point of aim would look wrong to every trained spotter watching. She dialed the windage, 1.5 mils right, almost a full mil less than Braddock had been using. She pressed her eye to the scope. At 35 power magnification, Draven was clearly visible. He had stopped pacing and was standing beside Voss, one hand gripping the hostage's shoulder, the knife held loosely in the other. Two armed guards flanked the scene. A third stood near the camera tripod, adjusting the angle. Ava's crosshair settled on Draven's chest. Then she lifted it. Higher. Higher. The crosshair rose until Draven disappeared from the scope entirely. At 14.3 mils of elevation, she was aiming at empty sky above the compound. The bullet would leave the barrel on an upward arc, reach its apex somewhere over the valley, and descend through 1,300 meters of frozen air, driven by gravity, shaped by wind, aimed at a point in space where mathematics said a man's chest would be when the bullet arrived. She wasn't aiming at Victor Draven. She was aiming at where physics said he would intersect with a piece of copper and led 4 seconds from now. "Spotter," she said quietly, "call the wind for me when I say." Webb hesitated, then pressed his eye to the spotting scope. "Ready?" Ava controlled her breathing. In for 4 seconds. Hold for 4. Out for 4. Hold for 4. The combat breathing drill she had never been trained in. She had learned it from Elias, who called it match breathing and used it before every competition shot. Her heartbeat slowed. The world narrowed to a tunnel. Scope, crosshair, sky, snow. She watched the snow crystals at the 400-meter mark. The eddy was spinning hard, pushing ice particles in a tight clockwise rotation. She waited. The rotation began to slow. The crystals started drifting more linearly. The layers were aligning. "Wind," she whispered. Webb read his kestrel. 31 knots, gusting to 36, left to right. That was the macro wind. It didn't account for the eddy. But Ava didn't need Webb to read the eddy. She could see it weakening in the snow. She exhaled halfway. Her finger moved from the trigger guard to the trigger. The crosshair floated in empty sky, impossibly high above where any sane shooter would aim. Ridge actual. Overwatch 1. Target has the knife at the hostage's throat. He is actively positioning for execution. Estimate 2 minutes or less. Harlow's voice came through, stripped of everything except command. "Mercer, you are cleared to fire." Ava didn't acknowledge. She was counting. The eddy weakened further. Snow crystals at 400 meters began moving in a near straight line. The alignment window was opening. She had maybe 8 seconds before the cycle reset and the eddy spun back up. She stopped breathing. Her heart beat once, twice. On the third beat, between the contraction and the pause, in the space between heartbeats where the human body is most still, her finger pressed the trigger straight back with 2.4 pounds of pressure. The rifle cracked. The round left the barrel at 2,915 feet per second, climbing into frozen air on the trajectory Ava had calculated. It was invisible almost immediately, a .338 caliber projectile smaller than a human finger, traveling faster than sound, arcing upward into the gray sky above the Blackstone Highlands. For 4.2 seconds, nobody on the ridge breathed. The bullet reached its apex and began to fall. It passed through the high-altitude shear zone where the eastward wind pushed it right, exactly as Ava had predicted. It descended through the weakened eddy zone at 400 meters, where the rotational current had temporarily softened to a manageable drift rather than a chaotic spin. It continued falling, accelerating under gravity, crossing the final 300 meters in a descending streak that no one on the ground saw coming. It struck Victor Draven center mass. The impact was catastrophic. At that range, the .338 Lapua still carried enough energy to collapse the warlord's chest cavity. Draven's body snapped backward, the knife flying from his hand, his feet leaving the ground for a fraction of a second before he crumpled into the snow beside the hostage he had been about to execute. On the ridge, Webb saw it first through the spotting scope. "Hit," he said. His voice cracked. "Target is down. Direct hit. Center mass." Harlow grabbed his radio. "All teams, ridge actual. Target is down. Confirm hostile status." Overwatch 1 confirms primary target is down, no movement. Hostage is alive. Hostage is moving. 2 armed guards are scrambling. They don't know where the shot came from. Ava didn't hear any of it. She was already chambering the next round. The bolt cycled with a smooth metallic snap. She found the first guard in her scope, the one nearest Voss, reaching for a weapon that was slung across his back. The eddy window was closing. She had seconds. She adjusted her windage a quarter mil right, correcting for the guard's position relative to where Draven had stood. The crosshair settled. She fired. The guard spun and dropped. Second round. Chamber. Bolt forward. Third guard. The one by the camera. He was running. Moving targets at 1,300 meters were a different equation entirely, requiring lead compensation that changed with every step. Ava tracked him for 1 second, estimated his speed at roughly 8 feet per second, held a half body length ahead of his direction of travel, and fired. Miss. The round sparked off concrete 2 feet behind him. She chambered again without hesitation. The guard had stopped running and was pressing himself against a wall, looking wildly toward the mountains. For a moment, he was still. Ava fired. He collapsed. 3 targets down, Webb reported, his voice now shaking openly. Overwatch, confirm? Confirmed. 3 hostiles neutralized. Additional fighters emerging from the south building. Count 5 hostiles moving toward the hostage position. Ava shifted the rifle. The new targets were clustered near the south building's doorway, 70 meters from where Voss was trying to crawl toward cover with his hands still bound. She had 4 rounds remaining in the magazine. The eddy was spinning back up. The alignment window had closed. She couldn't wait 90 seconds for the next one. Those fighters would reach Voss in 30. So Ava did something that would later become the most analyzed moment in the entire after-action report. She abandoned her calculated hold and shot instinct. Elias Mercer had called it wind feel. The ability to sense the correct holdover without running numbers. The way a basketball player feels the right arc on a shot without calculating parabolic trajectories. It was the highest level of marksmanship, and it couldn't be taught from a manual. It could only be developed through thousands of hours behind a rifle in unpredictable conditions. Ava had those hours. She fired 4 rounds in 11 seconds. 3 hit. 1 missed. The last fighter had ducked behind a concrete barrier half a second before the bullet arrived. 6 hits from 8 shots, Webb said. He wasn't reporting to the radio anymore. He was talking to himself, trying to process what he had just witnessed. 6 hits from 8 shots at 1,300 meters in 30-knot-plus variable wind. On the ridge, Staff Sergeant Braddock slowly lifted his head from behind his rifle. He looked 60 meters up the slope to where Ava Mercer lay behind Torres's rifle, still scanning the compound through her scope, still hunting. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Harlow's voice came across the radio, steady now, controlled. All teams, this is Ridge Actual. Assault element, you are cleared to advance. Sniper teams maintain overwatch. Mercer has primary engagement authority until assault element reaches the compound. The words hit the radio net like a thunderclap. Primary engagement authority. Given to a specialist, a logistics clerk, a woman who had been organizing ammunition crates 12 hours ago. Nobody challenged it. Across the valley, the assault element, a 12-man team that had been holding in a concealed position on the valley floor, began their advance toward the compound. They moved in a staggered column, weapons up, covering sectors with practiced precision. Above them, on the ridge, Ava Mercer tracked their movement through the scope, ready to eliminate any threat that appeared in their path. 2 more fighters emerged from the north building. Ava put both down before the assault element's point man even registered their presence. 8 hits from 10 shots. The assault team reached the compound without firing a single round. Every threat had been neutralized from the ridge. They found Captain Voss alive, bleeding from a gash on his forehead where he had hit the ground, but conscious and coherent. A medic cut his zip ties and began triage, while the rest of the team cleared the remaining structures. Draven's compound fell in 11 minutes. Later, much later, when the operation was over and the helicopters had carried Voss to a field surgical hospital, and the debriefs had begun and the classified reports were being drafted in windowless rooms at 3 separate installations, the question everyone asked was the same. Who is Ava Mercer? The answer, as it turned out, was far more complicated than anyone expected. The debrief happened in a heated tent at the forward operating base, 14 hours after the operation. Ava sat on a folding chair with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, still wearing the same cold weather gear, still smelling like gun oil and frozen sweat. Across from her sat Major Catherine Holt, a military intelligence officer with tired eyes and a digital recorder running on the table between them. Specialist Mercer, for the record, state your MOS and current assignment. 92 Yankee, Unit Armorer, currently assigned to Task Force Ridgeline as logistics support. And prior to today, had you ever engaged a hostile target with a firearm? No, ma'am. Had you ever fired a weapon in a combat environment? No. Holt looked at her notes. According to the after-action report filed by Sergeant First Class Harlow, you engaged 8 hostile targets at distances between 1,300 and 1,350 meters under extreme wind conditions, achieving a hit rate of 80%. You neutralized the primary high-value target, Victor Draven, with a single round to center mass at 1,327 meters. You provided overwatch fire that enabled the assault element to advance without contact. Your actions directly resulted in the rescue of Captain Nathan Voss. She paused. How? Ava looked at the coffee cup. The wind in the valley was creating layered currents that interacted in ways the standard models don't account for. I identified the interaction pattern by observing airborne ice crystals and developed a modified holdover that compensated for the rotational eddy at the 400-meter point. I also identified a cyclical alignment window in the wind pattern that gave approximately 8 seconds of reduced turbulence every 90 seconds. Holt studied her. Where did you learn to do this? Ava hesitated. It was the first time all day she had hesitated about anything. My grandfather taught me to shoot. He was a competitive long-range marksman. I competed nationally under a different name before I enlisted. Under a different name. My middle name, Grace. He didn't want people to connect me to his reputation. Why isn't any of this in your enlistment record or personnel file? Nobody asked. Holt leaned back. Specialist, you understand this is going to generate significant attention. The intelligence community is going to want a full debrief on the Voss rescue. The sniper community is going to want to understand your methodology. Your chain of command is going to have questions about how a 92 Yankee ended up as the primary shooter on a Tier 1 hostage rescue. I understand. Do you want that attention? Ava looked at her directly. I want Captain Voss to go home to his family. Everything else is paperwork. Holt turned off the recorder. She sat quietly for a moment, then spoke in a different tone. Less official, more human. Between you and me, Mercer, off the record. What were you thinking when Harlow gave you the rifle? Ava picked up the coffee cup, took a sip, and set it down. I was thinking about my grandfather. He always said the wind doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care about your rank or your record or how many people think you can't make the shot. The wind only cares whether you understand it. And if you do, it'll carry your bullet exactly where it needs to go. She paused. I understand the wind. Holt nodded slowly. She reached for the recorder again, then stopped. One more thing. Harlow tells me that after the operation, while the assault team was clearing the compound, you field-stripped Torres's rifle, cleaned it, and returned it to his position before he even got back to the ridge. It's my job, ma'am. I'm the armorer. You just executed one of the most extraordinary feats of marksmanship in modern military history and then went back to cleaning rifles. Ava shrugged. The rifle needed cleaning. 14 hours later, while the task force packed equipment for extraction, a classified message arrived at the forward operating base from a 3-star general at a command Ava had never heard of. The message was addressed to Harlow, but it concerned her. She was being reassigned, effective immediately, to a program whose name was redacted in the copy Harlow showed her at a location described only as CONUS Training Facility, for a purpose listed as assessment and potential integration into advanced marksmanship cadre. Harlow handed her the printed message in the armory tent while she was cataloging rifle parts. He stood there while she read it, watching her face for a reaction. She read it twice. When do I leave? She asked. 72 hours. She nodded and turned back to the rifle parts on the table. Mercer. She looked up. Harlow's face was harder to read than the wind. He was a man who had spent nearly 2 decades building teams, leading operations, and trusting systems that rewarded experience, rank, and proven combat records. Ava Mercer had none of those things. What she had done on the ridge broke every rule he operated by, and it had saved a man's life. "For the record," he said quietly, "I should have listened to you sooner." "You listened when it mattered, Sergeant. That's enough." He held her gaze for a moment, then turned and walked out of the tent. Ava stood alone in the armory, surrounded by rifles and cleaning kits and ammunition crates, holding a message that was about to change the entire trajectory of her life. She folded it carefully and put it in her breast pocket. Then she picked up the next rifle and went back to work. But somewhere in a facility she had never seen, behind doors she had never opened, people who had spent careers studying the limits of human marksmanship were watching a classified video feed of what had happened on the ridge. They replayed it 7 times. They ran the ballistic data through 3 separate simulation programs. They compared her hit probability against every recorded long-range engagement in the military's database. The numbers didn't make sense. Not because they were impossible, because they suggested that Ava Mercer had been operating below her actual capability, that the shots she took, as extraordinary as they were, represented a fraction of what she could do under optimal conditions. And the people watching that video had plans for her that went far beyond cleaning rifles. The facility didn't have a name on any map. 40 miles east of a town Ava had never heard of, in a stretch of high desert flat enough to see the curvature of the earth, a cluster of tan buildings sat behind double fencing and concertina wire. No signs, no flags, just a numeric code stenciled on the gate that meant nothing to anyone who didn't already belong here. Ava arrived on a Tuesday morning in the back seat of a government sedan, her duffel bag in the trunk, her personnel folder in a manila envelope on the seat. Everything she owned in the military fit into those 2 containers. Building 7 was a windowless box with fluorescent lights and linoleum floors. At the end of the hallway, a man stood at a conference room window with his back to her. Mid-50s, lean, cropped silver hair, civilian clothes that couldn't hide decades of military posture. He turned when she knocked. "Specialist Mercer, I'm James Wakefield. I run this program. Sit down." She sat. He remained standing, scrolling through a tablet. "I've read the Blackstone after-action report, reviewed the video, pulled your competition records going back 7 years. You competed as Grace Mercer in ELR circuits from age 14 through 21. 3 national junior titles, 2 open division podium finishes. Then you disappeared, enlisted, and spent 4 years maintaining other people's weapons." He set the tablet down. "Explain that to me." "My grandfather got sick. I needed the benefits. Logistics was the fastest path to a station where I could manage his care. You could have enlisted infantry and requested sniper school. Infantry meant longer deployments. My grandfather needed consistency, not a granddaughter gone 8 months out of 12. So you buried a nationally ranked career to become an armorer." "I didn't bury anything. I made a choice." Wakefield pulled out a chair and sat. "This facility trains advanced marksmanship instructors for Tier 1 units. Not shooters, instructors. The people who teach the people who do the work that doesn't make the news. Assessment phase is 12 weeks. You'll train alongside 8 other candidates, all with significantly more combat experience than you. If you pass, you enter the instructor pipeline. If you don't, you go back to wherever the Army puts you." "When do I start?" "Tomorrow, 0530. And Mercer, the other candidates have been here 3 weeks. They've been briefed on Blackstone. Most of them aren't impressed. If you're expecting the benefit of the doubt, adjust that expectation now." He walked out. The barracks held 8 bunks. When Ava pushed through the door, 6 candidates were present. Conversation stopped instantly. A thick-necked master sergeant named Dale Purcell spoke first, hands working a disassembled bolt carrier group on his lap. "So you're the armorer?" "Was. Now I'm a candidate, same as you." "Not the same. I've got 6 deployments, 4 confirmed long-range kills, and I graduated sniper school when you were in middle school." "Congratulations." "It's not a flex. It's context. Everyone here earned their spot through years of operational experience. You got here because you made 1 shot in a snowstorm." Ava finished unpacking before she turned to face him. "You're right. Everyone here has more combat time, but Wakefield didn't bring me here because of my resume. He brought me because I solved a problem none of you could have solved." From a nearby bunk, a lanky staff sergeant named Mitch Gallagher tossed a rubber ball at the ceiling. "Ease up, Dale. She hasn't been here 5 minutes. I'm setting expectations. You're being a prick." Gallagher caught the ball and sat up. "Look, Mercer, nobody's going to pretend we're not skeptical. But the range doesn't care about opinions. We'll find out tomorrow. That night, Ava called the care facility from the hallway phone bank. Darlene, her grandfather's nurse, told her Elias was having a good week, eating well, sleeping through the night, asking about Ava 3 times in 2 days. "He keeps asking if you won," Darlene said. "He doesn't say what, just asks if you won." Ava pressed her forehead against the phone. "Tell him I'm working on it." Awesome. The range complex covered 6 square miles of open desert, target arrays from 200 meters to beyond 3,000. Sergeant First Class Nina Orozco, the lead instructor, set the tone immediately. "Every week you train. Every Friday you test, scores weight accuracy, methodology, adaptability, and instructional clarity. You're not here to be the best shooter. You're here to be the best teacher of shooting. By week 6, at least 3 of you will be gone." Baseline day was straightforward, standard drills at 400, 600, 800, and 1,000 meters. Ava's groups were tight and consistent through 600. At 800, the field began to separate as wind increased and thermal distortion layered false signals over the mirage. Most candidates relied on kestrel readings. Ava watched the dust, fine desert particles that moved with the wind the same way snow crystals did in the mountains. Different medium, same principle. Read the environment, not the meter. At 1,000 meters, she held off instead of dialing, placing her crosshair left of target rather than adjusting turrets, an older competitive technique that allowed faster correction between shots when wind shifted. Orozco noticed. "You held off at 1,000. Wind was shifting between shots. Dialing costs 3 to 5 seconds per adjustment. Most instructors teach dial. Most instructors teach in conditions where the wind cooperates." Orozco made a note and moved on. The first evaluation exposed the gap that would define Ava's assessment. Her shooting composite ranked 2nd of 9. Her instructional composite ranked 7th. When Wakefield asked candidates to explain their wind methodology, most described an instrument-based process: kestrel reading, ballistic calculator, turret correction. Systematic, reliable, limited. Ava described something else. Wind isn't a number. A kestrel tells you wind speed at your position. It doesn't tell you what the wind is doing at 300 meters or at the target. Between you and the target, there are dozens of microenvironments creating local effects your meter can't measure. Purcell interrupted. "So what's the alternative, we guess?" "You read. You look at the environment between you and the target, vegetation, dust, mirage, and build a composite wind call that accounts for how the layers interact. That's what spotters do. Your process treats each indicator independently and averages them. Mine treats them as a system. The difference matters when layers interact, like they did at Blackstone. The theory was sound. The delivery was not. When Ava tried to explain how to distinguish thermal mirage from wind-driven mirage, she reached for descriptions that sounded like feelings. There's a quality to the thermal that looks thicker, denser. Purcell pounced. Thicker. That's the technical term? Laughter from 3 candidates. Not cruel, frustrated. Ava felt heat climb her neck. After class, Orozco pulled her aside. "Your wind theory is interesting, but explaining and teaching aren't the same thing. You gave a lecture. A student who watches your lecture understands intellectually. That doesn't mean they can do it. Teaching means building a skill. Figure out how to translate what you feel into something someone else can follow." Wakefield was blunter. "A gift that can't be transferred is just a party trick. Your instructional rank is 7th. Fix it." She attacked the problem the way she attacked everything, with discipline and isolation. Every evening after dinner, while other candidates played cards or called home, Ava sat on her bunk with a notebook and reverse-engineered her own expertise. She asked a question she had never needed to ask. How do I actually read the wind? Not the theory, the real answer. She broke it into 3 steps. First, identify macro wind, dominant direction and speed from large-scale indicators. Second, segment the flight path into thirds. Identify local deviations at each point. These 2 steps could be taught. The third step was the problem. She mentally combined macro wind and deviations into a single integrated picture. Not calculation, but pattern matching against thousands of wind patterns observed over 17 years. Like a chess grandmaster evaluating a board position, it was built from decades of repetition. She couldn't give students 20 years of experience, so she needed a shortcut, The idea came at 2 in the morning during week 4. What if she didn't teach the intuition at all, but created a decision framework that approximated what her brain did automatically? She called it the Layered Wind Assessment Protocol. Segment the flight path, classify each wind layer's interaction type as compressive or shearing, then apply a correction table she built from her own experience data over 6 sleepless nights. She tested it on herself at 1,200 meters. Her group opened 30% compared to instinctive shooting. But every round hit. The protocol was less accurate than her gut, but more accurate than the standard method. And it was teachable. Well, week 6 brought the proof. Each candidate was paired with a junior shooter and given 1 week to improve their performance. Ava drew Corporal Jesse Whitfield, a 23-year-old designated marksman from the 82nd Airborne, competent, conventional, trained to trust his kestrel and dial his turrets. Their first session, she had him fire 5 rounds at 1,000 meters using his standard method. 3 hits, 2 misses right. You overcorrected because the wind at your position is 8 knots, but there's a terrain feature at 600 meters creating a wind shadow. The bullet passes through less crosswind than your kestrel predicted. Whitfield stared. You figured that out by looking at dust. I figured it out by looking at the environment instead of just the instruments. That's what I'm going to teach you. 5 days. She walked him through the protocol step by step. Whitfield struggled, overcorrected, reverted to his kestrel, tried again. By day 3, something clicked. The dust at 400 is moving faster than the mirage at 600, he said, eye on his scope. Near third wind is stronger than mid-third. Interaction is compressive, so I reduce my correction by 10%? Closer to 15 here, fire. The round clanged against steel at 1,100 meters. Whitfield looked at her with an expression she recognized from her own face years ago, when Elias collapsed a problem she'd fought for months. By week's end, Whitfield's 1,000-meter hit rate improved from 60 to 82%. His 1,200-meter rate went from 35 to 67%, the largest percentage gain of any student candidate pairing. Wakefield called her in. Your instructional composite moved from 7th to 3rd. The trajectory is right, but don't get comfortable. Week 8 is mountain phase. Cold, complex terrain, layered wind. You'll have a natural advantage from Blackstone, and I'll compensate by raising your bar. You won't be scored against the others. You'll be scored against what I think you're capable of. That doesn't seem fair. Fair isn't the point. On her way out, he handed her a sealed envelope. This came through channels. Personal. She opened it in the hallway. A billing letter from the care facility. Elias's insurance claim for a new medication, $1,200 a month, had been denied. Payment within 30 days, or treatment would be discontinued. Ava folded the letter and stood under the fluorescent light, feeling the weight of a problem that couldn't be solved with a rifle. Her hardship assistance request had been under review for 6 weeks. No one returned her calls. There was no one else to ask. Her mother had left when she was 4. Her uncle communicated through late birthday cards with a $20 bill inside. She put the letter in her pocket, went back to the barracks, picked up her notebook, and kept refining the correction table because that was a problem she could solve, and she needed to solve something. Mountain phase began on a Monday, and the desert vanished behind them. The training site sat above 7,000 feet in a western range. Ava wasn't told where, and the aircraft windows were covered. What she knew from her watch's altitude reading was that she was back in the kind of terrain where the wind didn't follow rules. Targets were placed across valleys, on opposing ridges, at angles requiring compensation for elevation and complex wind simultaneously. Thin air, serious cold, wind layering, shearing, folding back on itself. First day, 1,400 meters. 3 candidates failed to hit the target. The wind was doing what mountain wind always did. Ava hit 5 for 5, not because she was the best shooter, because she had spent 6 weeks building a system designed for exactly this chaos. Purcell hit 3 for 5. His face told the story. Walking back to the tent line, Gallagher fell into step beside her. Nice shooting. Thanks. I used your protocol today on the 1,400-meter shoot. My standard method gave me 1.8 mils right. Yours gave me 1.4. I split the difference. And? Hit 4 for 5. The miss was the one where I used my original number. He let that sit. I'm not saying you've cracked the code, Mercer, but your system picked up something mine didn't. and I've been reading Mountain Wind for 12 years. It still needs work. Everything needs work. That's the whole point of being here. They walked the rest of the way in silence, and for the first time since arriving, the quiet between Ava and another candidate didn't feel like distance. It felt like the beginning of something she couldn't name yet. That night, after camp settled and Mountain Wind howled through the tent canvas, Ava's phone buzzed with a text from Darlene. She read it by the glow of her watch light. Elias had been hospitalized, a fall in his room, possible fracture. Conscious but confused, asking for someone named Grace, not understanding why she wasn't there. Ava lay in the dark with the phone pressed to her chest, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the wind outside sounded like something she couldn't read, something vast and indifferent and completely beyond her control. She didn't sleep. The wind battered the tent walls in irregular surges that sounded like breathing, deep, slow inhalations followed by sharp exhales that snapped the canvas taut and rattled the aluminum frame poles. Ava lay on her cot with her eyes open, staring at the dark ceiling, holding the phone against her sternum as if the warmth of the screen could transmit something back through the network to a hospital room where an old man was calling a name that nobody around him recognized. Grace, not Ava. Grace, the name she had used in competition, the name Elias associated with rifles and wind and long afternoons on hillsides, where the only thing that mattered was the next shot. He wasn't asking for his granddaughter, he was asking for the shooter. The version of her that existed in whatever fragment of memory his declining mind could still hold. At 04:15, she gave up pretending sleep was possible. She pulled on her boots in the dark, grabbed her cold weather jacket, and stepped outside. The mountain air hit her like a slap, thin, dry, well below freezing. Stars hung in a cloudless sky so dense they looked artificial. The camp was silent, except for the wind and the low hum of a generator running somewhere behind the supply tent. She walked to the edge of the perimeter and stood there, looking down into the valley where the training ranges lay invisible in the darkness. Tomorrow's evaluation was a complex engagement exercise, multiple targets at varying distances across broken terrain, with artificial time pressure and scored penalties for misses. Wakefield had designed it specifically to test adaptability under stress. The ability to shift between targets, recalculate wind for each engagement, and maintain accuracy while fatigue and urgency degraded decision-making. Ava needed to perform well. Her composite score was climbing, but mountain phase would determine whether she advanced or washed out. Everything she had built over the past weeks, the protocol, the correction table, the fragile credibility she had earned through Whitfield's improvement, depended on the next 4 days of shooting. And she couldn't stop thinking about Elias lying in a hospital bed, confused, alone, calling for someone who wasn't coming. She pulled out her phone and typed a message to Darlene. It was too early to call, but the text would be waiting when the morning shift started. "How is he? What did the doctor say about the fracture?" "I can't get leave right now. Please tell him Grace is thinking about him." She put the phone away and stood in the cold until her fingers went numb, watching the stars blur as the wind pushed moisture into her eyes. The evaluation started at 0700 under conditions that felt personally punitive. Wind was gusting 25 to 35 knots, quartering from the left rear. The most difficult angle for a right-handed shooter because it pushed the bullet in a direction that intuition wanted to fight. Temperature was 8 degrees, visibility was excellent, which meant every miss would be observed clearly by the instructors positioned behind the firing line with spotting scopes and scoring tablets. Orozco briefed the exercise. 12 targets across the valley. Steel silhouettes at ranges from 600 to 1600 meters. You engage in sequence, 1 through 12. Each target must be hit within 90 seconds of the previous engagement. Misses are scored as penalties. Time penalties for exceeding the 90-second window. Total score is hits minus penalties. Questions. Purcell raised a hand. ROE on ammunition. Unlimited rounds per target, but every miss after the first cost you a point, so don't miss. The candidates drew lots for firing order. Ava drew 7th. She spent the first hour watching the 6 shooters before her, not their rifles, but the valley, cataloging wind patterns, identifying terrain features that created local effects, building the layered picture she would need when her turn came. Purcell shot 3rd. He was methodical, precise, and fast. He cleared 10 of 12 targets with minimal misses, struggling only at the 2 longest distances where the wind shear became unpredictable. His composite score would be strong. Gallagher shot fifth. He used a hybrid approach, his own standard method blended with elements of Ava's protocol, and hit 9 of 12 cleanly. When he walked off the line, he caught Ava's eye and gave a small shrug that said, "Not bad, not great." When Ava's name was called, she moved to the firing position with her rifle and settled into the prone. The ground was frozen and uneven, a shelf of rock and compacted snow that offered no comfortable platform. She adjusted her bipod, established her natural point of aim on the first target, and began her wind assessment. Macro wind. Left rear. Estimated 28 knots sustained. Near third deviation, slightly reduced behind a boulder field that broke the ground level current. Mid-third, full exposure, wind accelerating through a natural channel between two ridge lines. Far third, target positioned in a partial wind shadow created by the opposing slope. Compressive interaction between mid and far thirds. Correction factor. Reduced standard windage by 12%. She dialed. She fired. The steel rang at 600 meters. She transitioned to target 2. 750 meters, slightly higher elevation, different wind angle. New assessment, adjust. Fire, hit, target 3. 900 meters. The wind shifted as she was building her solution, a gust that changed direction by 15 degrees and held for 6 seconds before reverting. She waited, let the gust pass. Fired in the lull. Hit. She moved through this sequence with a rhythm that was neither fast nor slow, but relentlessly steady. Each target received the same process: assess, classify, correct, fire. The protocol worked. Not perfectly. On target 8, at 1,200 meters, she missed her first round by what Webb would have estimated as 6 inches left, overcorrecting for a shearing interaction that was weaker than she had classified. She adjusted and hit on her second shot, absorbing the penalty point. Target 11, 1,400 meters. The wind was at its worst here. The channel effect in the mid-third was funneling gusts that arrived at the bullet's flight path at unpredictable intervals. 2 candidates before her had failed this target entirely. Ava took her time. She watched the snow crystals in the valley, the same technique she had used at Blackstone, and identified a brief window where the channel gusts subsided. She waited through 2 cycles, counting the interval. 18 seconds of calm, then 12 seconds of chaos. 18 and 12. Repeating. She fired during the third calm window. Hit. Target 12. 1,600 meters. The longest distance in the exercise. At this range, the bullet would be in flight for over 2 seconds, passing through every wind layer in the valley. Even her protocol couldn't fully map the interactions at this distance. There were too many variables, too many layers, too many micro effects between the muzzle and the target. She needed instinct. She put the notebook down, closed her eyes for 3 seconds, and when she opened them, she looked at the valley the way Elias had taught her to look. Not analyzing, not calculating, but absorbing, taking in the whole picture, letting the patterns find her instead of hunting for them. The wind told her what it was doing. She adjusted her hold, not by the protocol, by feel. She fired. 2.3 seconds later, the distant steel target sent back a faint, delayed clang that reached the firing line almost as an afterthought. Hit. 11 of 12 targets, 1 miss corrected on second round. Total score 10 points net, the highest of the day. Orozco wrote the number on her clipboard without comment. Wakefield, standing 10 meters behind the line, watched Ava clear her rifle and walk off the position. His face revealed nothing, but he made a note in his book and underlined it twice. The scores were posted that evening in the briefing tent. Ava's composite had moved to second overall, behind Purcell by a margin of 4 points. Her accuracy score was the highest in the cohort. Her instructional score, still lagging, kept her from the top spot. Purcell studied the board for a long time without speaking. Then he turned to the room. Shooting well doesn't make her ready to teach operators. Nobody responded. But the silence felt different than it had 6 weeks ago. Back then, the silence after Purcell's jabs had been agreement, the quiet consensus of a room that shared his skepticism. Now it was uncomfortable, the silence of people who were starting to question whether the loudest voice in the room was also the right one. Gallagher broke it. She taught Whitfield to gain 20+ percentage points in a week, Dale. That's not nothing. Whitfield's a corporal. Teaching a corporal is not the same as teaching a Tier 1 operator who's been shooting for 15 years. Then let her try. Stop talking about what she can't do and let the program figure it out. Purcell's jaw worked. He looked at Ava, who was sitting on a folding chair in the corner reading Darlene's reply text. Hairline fracture, left wrist. Cast applied. He's stable but disoriented. Keeps asking when Grace is coming to pick him up for the match. Mercer. She looked up. You hearing this? I heard it. You got anything to say? I've got a grandfather in a hospital who thinks I'm coming to take him to a shooting match. So no, Purcell, I don't have anything to say about your opinions on my qualifications right now. The room went quiet in a different way. Not evaluative, not uncomfortable, just quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when someone reveals a piece of themselves that makes judgment feel petty. Purcell looked at the floor. He didn't apologize. That wasn't in his wiring. But he turned away and busied himself with his gear. And for the first time in the program, he didn't push. Ashat. Wakefield called Ava into the command tent the next morning. I've been informed about your grandfather's situation. If you need to request emergency leave, I don't. Mercer, nobody here is going to think less of you for... I said I don't. He's stable. The facility is managing his care. Me sitting in a hospital room won't heal a fractured wrist, and it won't slow down what's happening to his mind. The best thing I can do for him is finish this program and get into a position where I can actually provide for him long term. Wakefield studied her for a moment. All right, but I want you to know the option is there. Noted. What's today's exercise? He paused, as if debating whether to push the personal conversation further. Then he shifted to the professional register she was clearly demanding. Today is different. We've received a request from a unit that's training in the adjacent valley. They're running a field problem, a simulated hostage rescue with live-fire sniper support. Their designated marksman team requested additional overwatch from our facility. I volunteered 2 candidates to provide that support. Who? You and Purcell. Ava looked at him. Together. Together. You'll be operating as a 2-person sniper team. Purcell shoots, you spot. Or the reverse. You 2 work that out between yourselves. And if we can't agree, then you fail the exercise. Teamwork isn't optional in operational instruction. Every graduate of this program will eventually be embedded with units where personality conflicts are a given. Learning to function with people who don't like you is part of the curriculum. He handed her a map and a briefing packet. Rally point is at 0900. Don't be late. Purcell was already at the rally point when Ava arrived. He was kneeling beside his rifle case, assembling his weapon with the mechanical efficiency of a man who could do it blindfolded, which, knowing his background, he probably could. He didn't look up when she approached. Wakefield's idea of team building, he said flatly. Apparently. I'll shoot. You spot. No. He looked up. Excuse me? The exercise is a simulated hostage rescue in mountain terrain. Complex wind, multiple targets at varying ranges, time pressure. That's exactly the scenario my protocol was designed for. I should be on the gun. You've been in this program for 9 weeks. I've been a sniper for 12 years. And in 9 weeks, I've outscored you in accuracy 3 times. His face reddened. Accuracy on a scoring exercise is not the same as what? As combat? You're right, but this isn't combat either. It's a simulation. And if we're being evaluated on performance, then the shooter should be the one with the higher accuracy composite. That's me. Purcell stood up. He was a full head taller than her, broad across the shoulders, and he used his size the way some men do when words aren't winning the argument. Not threatening, but present, taking up space as a form of emphasis. If I let a supply clerk take the gun on a live fire exercise and something goes wrong, that's on my record. If you let ego override performance data and we score lower than we should, that's on your record too. They stared at each other across the frozen ground. The wind swept between them, carrying ice crystals that stung exposed skin. Purcell broke first. Not with concession, with pragmatism. Fine, you shoot, I spot. But I'm calling the wind. We both call the wind. If our numbers differ, we discuss. If we can't agree, we go with the protocol. Your protocol. The protocol that's been outperforming standard methods for 4 weeks. His jaw worked. Let's move. The simulated hostage rescue was run by a company from the 2nd Ranger Battalion conducting mountain warfare certification. The scenario was straightforward. A notional enemy force had seized a mountain outpost and was holding 3 role players as hostages. An assault element would approach from the south. Sniper Overwatch, Ava and Purcell, would provide cover fire from a ridge position to the east, engaging designated targets on command to enable the assault team's approach. The targets were mannequin-sized steel silhouettes placed at positions around the outpost, ranging from 700 to 1,300 meters from the Overwatch position. Each target was marked with a priority number. Some were positioned near the hostage locations, requiring precision to avoid collateral scoring penalties. Others were in exposed positions that would be straightforward engagements if the wind cooperated. The wind was not cooperating. Mountain conditions had worsened since morning. Sustained winds of 30 knots with gusts above 40 were channeling through the valley, creating the same layered interactive wind systems that had defined the Blackstone engagement. Snow was falling intermittently, not heavy accumulation, but enough to create a veil of airborne ice crystals that degraded visibility and provided wind-reading indicators simultaneously. Ava and Purcell occupied their designated position, a natural rock shelf on the eastern ridge with a clear line of sight to the outpost below. Ava set up the rifle while Purcell established the spotting scope beside her. They worked in silence, each performing their task with the professional efficiency of people who knew their jobs even if they didn't like each other. "Range to target 1, Ava said. Purcell lazed it. 742. Target 2, 918. Target 3, 1105, 4 through 6, 1260, 1291, 1320. 6 targets. Distances spanning nearly 600 meters of variation, each requiring a different wind solution, and they would need to engage them rapidly, on command, as the assault element advanced. Ava opened her notebook and began building solutions for each target. Purcell watched her through the spotting scope, calling out wind indicators he observed in the valley. Mirage at 800 meters is running hard right. Estimate 20-plus knots at that point. I see it, but look at the snow at 1000. It's moving slower. The ridge on the south side is blocking ground-level wind. Mid-valley is calmer than the firing position. Purcell looked. I see the snow pattern, but Mirage doesn't lie. Mirage at 800 isn't representative of conditions at 1100. The terrain creates a discontinuity. Your Kestrel reading up here says 32 knots. The actual wind at the target is probably 15 to 20. You're guessing. I'm reading. Purcell pulled back from the spotting scope and looked at her. Not with hostility, with the hard, calculating focus of a man whose professional instincts were being challenged by evidence he didn't want to accept. If you're wrong, and I call the shot based on your read, we miss in front of a ranger company. If I'm right, and you override me with your Kestrel number, we miss anyway. The radio crackled. Overwatch, this is Assault Lead. We are at Phase Line Bravo. Request sniper clearance on targets 1 and 2. Standing by. Ava looked at Purcell. Call it. Purcell's jaw worked. 3 seconds. 5. The radio was waiting. Use your numbers, he said. Ava dialed her solution for target 1. The crosshair settled on the steel silhouette at 742 meters. Relatively short range, but the wind at the firing position was pushing hard enough to require significant correction. Her protocol said the actual wind effect on the bullet would be less than the Kestrel indicated because the terrain broke the ground current between 300 and 500 meters. She held a correction 20% lower than what Purcell's standard method would have prescribed. She fired. The silhouette rang. Purcell exhaled through his nose. Hit, transitioning to target 2. Ava worked the bolt, shifted her position, and acquired the second target at 918 meters. Different angle, different wind corridor, different terrain between muzzle and target. New assessment. She ran the protocol in her head. 12 seconds of analysis compressed into the mental equivalent of reading a sentence. She fired. Hit. Overwatch, Assault Lead, targets 1 and 2 confirmed down. Advancing to Phase Line Charlie, request clearance on targets 3 and 4. Target 3 sat at 1105 meters in the partial wind shadow she had identified. Target 4 was at 1260 meters on exposed ground where the wind hit full force. Engaging them back-to-back meant switching between 2 completely different wind solutions in the time it took to cycle the bolt. Give me target 3 wind, Ava said. Purcell read his Kestrel. 34 knots at our position. Cross-referencing Mirage at target range. I see moderate movement, consistent with maybe 18 to 20 knots. I agree. 15 to 20 at the target. Correction is 1.2 mils. My number says 1.6. Your number is based on averaging the wind across the flight path. Mine segments it. The first 400 meters get full wind. The last 700 get reduced wind behind the south ridge. The average overstates the effect. Purcell's mouth was a thin line. 1.2. 1.2. Send it. She fired. The distant clang took nearly a full second to reach them. Hit. Target 4. Exposed ground. No wind shadow. Full gust effect. This was where her protocol and Purcell's standard method would converge. When the wind was consistent across the flight path, both approaches yielded similar corrections. 2.1 mils, Ava said. I agree. 2.1. She fired. Hit. Overwatch. Assault lead. 3 and 4 confirmed. Moving to phase line Delta. Be advised, we are taking simulated fire from the north building. Request immediate clearance on targets 5 and 6. Time critical. Time critical. Targets 5 and 6 were the deepest shots, 1291 and 1320 meters, near identical ranges but different wind corridors. And the assault team was requesting rapid engagement, which meant no time for deliberate wind analysis on each shot. Ava made a decision. Purcell, I'm going to fire both on instinct, no protocol. I need you to watch my trace and tell me if I'm off. He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, not trust exactly, but the recognition that in this moment, with this pressure, she was making the right call. The protocol was a tool. Instinct was the weapon behind the tool, and Ava's instinct at 1,300 meters in mountain wind was the reason she was here. Send it, he said. Ava found target 5 in her scope. 1,291 meters. She looked at the snow between her and the target, a 3-second scan that told her everything the Kestrel couldn't. Wind was shearing at the midpoint, pushing the bullet right in the first half and left in the second half, creating a net drift that was smaller than either component would suggest. She held a correction that accounted for the net, not the parts. Fired. Hit. Bolt. Cycle. Shift to target 6. 1320, slightly different angle, slightly different wind corridor, but the same shearing pattern was visible in the snow. She adjusted a 1/4 mil and fired without waiting for the first round's impact report. The second clang reached the ridge a half-second after the first. Hit. All targets neutralized, Purcell reported to the radio. His voice was flat, professional, stripped of everything personal. But when he pulled back from the spotting scope and looked at Ava, his eyes carried something she hadn't seen before. It wasn't admiration. Purcell didn't do admiration. It was the involuntary respect of a craftsman recognizing mastery in a discipline he had devoted his life to. 6 for 6, he said quietly, in gusting 30+, at ranges past 1,300. Ava cleared the rifle and safed the bolt. Her hands were trembling, not from cold, not from nerves, but from the adrenaline crash that followed sustained precision under pressure. She pressed her palms flat against the frozen rock and breathed until the trembling stopped. The protocol got us through 1 through 4, she said. 5 and 6 were feel. I know, I watched your holds. Your correction on 5 was 0.4 mils, less than anything I would have called. The shearing pattern at the midpoint cancels part of the drift. The net effect is smaller than the individual layers. Purcell was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that cost him more than any shot he had ever taken. I couldn't have made that call. The shearing cancellation. I see it now that you've explained it, but I wouldn't have seen it in real time. Not at that speed. Ava looked at him. You would have, eventually. The protocol teaches you where to look. After that, it's repetition. Is that what your grandfather told you? Something like that. Purcell began packing the spotting scope. He worked slowly, methodically, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something private. Not meant for the range or the radio or the rest of the cohort, but just for the two of them on this frozen ridge. My kid wants to shoot competitively. She's 14. I've been trying to teach her wind, and she looks at me like I'm speaking Mandarin. I keep telling her to read the mirage, and she keeps telling me she doesn't know what she's looking at. He paused. Maybe she needs a different teacher. It was the closest Dale Purcell would ever come to an apology. Ava understood that, and she didn't push for more. When we get back to the main facility, she said, I'll show you the protocol's teaching progression. The first 3 steps are designed for people who've never read Wind before, 14-year-olds included. He nodded once and shouldered his pack. They walked down the ridge together. Not as friends, they would probably never be friends, but as 2 professionals who had found the narrow band of ground where mutual respect could exist without requiring mutual affection. So, Wakefield was waiting at the bottom of the ridge when they arrived. Beside him stood a man Ava had never seen, a colonel in cold-weather combat gear with a unit patch she didn't recognize and the quiet bearing of someone accustomed to rooms where decisions carried permanent consequences. Mercer Purcell, this is Colonel Briggs, Mus. Briggs didn't extend a hand. He looked at both of them with an expression that was neither friendly nor unfriendly, simply operational. I just observed your Overwatch performance from the assault element's position. Clean work. Who was on the gun? Mercer, Purcell said. No hesitation, no qualification. Briggs looked at Ava. 6 for 6 at distances past 1,300 in conditions I wouldn't have asked my own designated marksman to engage in. Impressive. Thank you, sir. Wakefield tells me you've developed a new wind-reading methodology. It's still in development. The correction table needs validation across more environments and shooters. I'm not interested in the table's readiness level. I'm interested in its application to a problem I'm currently dealing with. He turned to Wakefield. Can we use your briefing tent? What? The briefing was classified. Briggs spread a terrain map across the folding table and placed 4 photographs beside it. Ava recognized the landscape immediately. Mountain terrain, steep valleys, complex ridgelines, similar to where they were training but at higher altitude, with narrower valleys and more extreme terrain features. My unit is preparing for a deployment to a high-altitude operating environment. We'll be conducting operations in terrain that creates severe wind channeling, valleys that function as wind tunnels with thermal layering that makes standard ballistic calculations unreliable. He looked at Ava. Sound familiar? It sounds exactly like the Blackstone Highlands. It's worse. The valleys are narrower, the elevation is higher, and our targets will be at ranges past 1,500 meters in conditions where the wind changes faster than a shooter can adjust. How are your marksmen currently handling it? They're not. We've run 6 simulated engagements in comparable terrain, and our hit rate at distances beyond 1,200 meters is below 40%. That's unacceptable for the mission profile we're looking at. Ava studied the map. The terrain features were clearly marked: ridgelines, saddles, draws, valley floors. She could see the wind channeling potential immediately, the way the narrow valleys would compress and accelerate airflow, creating the same kind of layered, interactive wind systems that had defeated 15 snipers at Blackstone. How much time before deployment? She asked. 11 weeks. How many designated marksmen? 16. 4-man teams, 4 teams. Ava looked at Wakefield. He was leaning against the tent pole with his arms crossed, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Sir, am I being asked what I think I'm being asked? Wakefield uncrossed his arms. Colonel Briggs is requesting that our program provide an instructor to conduct a specialized wind-reading course for his marksmen prior to deployment. Given the nature of the terrain and the methodology required, I've recommended you. I haven't completed the assessment program. No, you haven't. But your instructional composite has been climbing steadily. Your accuracy composite is the highest in the cohort, and the protocol you've developed is specifically designed for the conditions Colonel Briggs is describing. No other candidate in this program, including Purcell, has the combination of skills this assignment requires. Purcell, standing in the corner of the tent, said nothing. His silence was louder than any objection he could have voiced. If I take this assignment, Ava said carefully, what happens to my assessment? You complete the assessment through the assignment. Briggs's marksmen are your final evaluation cohort. If their performance improves to operational standards using your methodology, you graduate the program. If it doesn't, you don't. Ava looked at the map again. 16 marksmen, 11 weeks. Complex terrain. A methodology she had been refining for barely 2 months, tested on 1 student and validated on 1 field exercise. The weight of it pressed against her chest. I need to make a phone call first, she said. Wakefield nodded. Briggs looked puzzled but didn't object. Ava stepped outside the tent into the bitter mountain air and called the care facility. This time she didn't ask for Darlene. She asked for Elias's room. The phone rang 6 times. Then a voice she knew better than any voice in the world answered. Thin, confused, but present. "Hello? Grandpa, it's Grace." A long pause. She could hear him breathing. Then slowly, recognition. "Gracie, where are you? We have a match this weekend. I need to check the wind flags." Her throat tightened. "I know, Grandpa. I'm getting ready for a match right now. A big one." "Is the wind bad?" She looked at the mountains around her, at the snow streaming off the ridgelines in horizontal plumes, at the valley below where 16 marksmen needed to learn what Elias had spent a lifetime teaching one small girl. "Yeah," she said, "the wind is bad." "Then you know what to do. Don't fight it, read it, let it show you." "I know. You were always better at that than anyone, Gracie. Even better than me. You just don't know it yet." She pressed the phone hard against her ear, trying to hold on to the clarity in his voice, knowing it might not be there the next time she called. Knowing that the man who had given her everything, every skill, every lesson, every patient afternoon on a windswept hillside, was disappearing by degrees, and there was no protocol, no framework, no system she could build to stop it. "I love you, Grandpa." "Love you too, Gracie. Win the match." The line went quiet. She heard the nurse's voice in the background, gentle, redirecting him. Then a click. Ava stood in the cold for a full minute. She didn't wipe her eyes. She let the wind do it, the same wind that had defined her life, that had carried her bullets and shaped her career and connected her to a man who was slipping away. Then she went back inside the tent. "I'll do it," she said. Briggs nodded. Wakefield made a note. Purcell, still standing in the corner, met her eyes for a brief moment and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, the kind of acknowledgement that carried more weight than anything he had ever said to her. Boom. 2 days later, Ava boarded a transport aircraft with her duffel bag, her rifle case, and a binder containing the layered wind assessment protocol, now expanded to 46 pages of methodology, correction tables, teaching progressions, and evaluation metrics. She left the mountain training site the same way she had arrived at the desert facility weeks ago, alone, carrying everything she owned, heading toward a group of people who had no reason to believe she could teach them anything. The difference was that this time she believed it herself. The transport landed at a forward training installation nestled in a mountain valley that made the assessment site look gentle. The terrain was savage, jagged peaks, narrow gorges, slopes so steep that the tree line gave up 1,000 feet below the operating altitude. Wind was constant, aggressive, and layered in exactly the ways Briggs had described. A master sergeant named Harlan Cobb met her on the tarmac. He was the senior marksman in Briggs's unit, the team leader responsible for the 16 shooters Ava was about to train. He was 41, built like a firefighter, and he looked at Ava the way every experienced operator looked at her, with polite skepticism wrapped in institutional courtesy. "Specialist Mercer, I'm Cobb. Welcome to the Valley." "Thank you, Master Sergeant. Colonel Briggs spoke highly of your performance at the mountain assessment, said you hit 6 for 6 in gusting 30 plus. "I did." "Impressive. My guys hit about 4 for 6 on a good day in these conditions, and they've been training here for 3 months. "That's why I'm here." Cobb studied her. "I'll be straight with you, Specialist. My team is skeptical. They've been taught by some of the best sniper instructors in the military, and they're being told that a logistics specialist with no combat deployments is going to improve their shooting in 11 weeks. That's a hard sell." "I'm not selling anything, Master Sergeant. I'm teaching a methodology. It either works or it doesn't. The range will tell us." "Fair enough. You start tomorrow. Classroom at 06, range at 08. I'll have all 16 present." He turned to walk away, then paused. "One more thing. These men are operators. They've been downrange. They've taken shots that mattered. If you stand in front of them and talk about how the air feels thicker, you'll lose them in 5 minutes." Ava thought about Purcell, about Orozco's feedback, about the painful lesson of standing in front of a room and watching her credibility evaporate because she couldn't translate instinct into instruction. "I won't," she said. "I have something better now, Shakish." She spent that night in her quarters, a small room in the transient barracks with a metal desk, a wall locker, and a window overlooking the valley. She spread the protocol binder across the desk and reviewed every page, making final adjustments, tightening language, adding examples from the mountain assessment. At midnight, she closed the binder and sat in the dark, listening to the wind howl through the valley outside her window. 16 shooters, 11 weeks. a methodology that was still partly theory, a teaching skill she had been developing for barely 2 months. And behind everything, the constant, grinding knowledge that Elias was fading, that the source code of everything she knew was being erased by a disease she couldn't fight. She was terrified. Not of the shooting, never of the shooting. Terrified of standing in front of 16 combat veterans and asking them to trust a process that lived, at its deepest level, in a place she still couldn't fully explain. Terrified that the protocol was a bridge between instinct and instruction, but that the bridge might not hold when 16 different minds tried to cross it at once. She opened her notebook to a blank page and wrote a single line at the top. What would Elias do? The answer came immediately, in his voice, the way he had said it 100 times on 100 windy hillsides. Stop thinking about yourself. Think about the wind. She closed the notebook, set her alarm for 05, lay down on the bunk and stared at the ceiling until sleep finally took her sometime after 1, while the mountain wind screamed through the valley like something alive and searching. Tomorrow she would stand in front of 16 men who didn't believe in her and teach them to see something they had never seen before. Tomorrow the wind would either prove her right or tear everything apart. She slept with her grandfather's voice in her ears, telling her to win the match. She woke before the alarm. The wind had stopped sometime around 4 in the morning, and the sudden silence was what pulled her out of sleep, the absence of sound more startling than sound itself. Ava lay still for 10 seconds, listening to nothing, then swung her legs off the bunk and planted her feet on cold concrete. 0512. 48 minutes before the classroom session, she dressed in the dark, splashed water on her face from the sink in the corner, and opened the protocol binder one last time. 46 pages. 11 weeks. 16 men who had been told a supply clerk was going to fix what years of elite training hadn't. She closed the binder, tucked it under her arm, and walked out into a morning so still it felt staged. The classroom was a converted maintenance bay at the north end of the installation. Concrete floor, metal walls, a whiteboard bolted to a support beam, and 20 folding chairs arranged in 4 rows. When Ava arrived at 0550, Master Sergeant Cobb was already there, leaning against the wall with a coffee cup, and the expression of a man bracing for something he couldn't prevent. "They're coming," he said. Most of them, anyway. Sergeant Kilpatrick had a dental appointment he suddenly remembered about 10 minutes ago. How many will I actually have? 15 out of 16. Kilpatrick will show up once he hears it's not optional. Ava set the binder on the table at the front of the room, uncapped a marker, and wrote 3 words on the whiteboard. Wind is a system. Then she waited. They filed in over the next 8 minutes. 15 men in various configurations of combat and cold weather gear, carrying coffee, skepticism, and the particular body language of experienced operators being told to sit in a classroom. They were older than Whitfield, harder than the assessment cohort, and they evaluated Ava with the fast, comprehensive scanning that came from years of entering rooms where threat assessment was survival. Nobody sat in the front row. Ava didn't comment on it. She waited until the last man settled, then spoke without preamble. "My name is Specialist Mercer. I'm here because your hit rate at distances past 1,200 meters in complex mountain wind is 38%. Colonel Briggs needs that number above 70 before you deploy. I have 11 weeks to get you there." A sergeant in the second row, thick arms, shaved head, tattoo creeping above his collar, leaned back in his chair. "And your qualification for teaching us is what, exactly?" "My qualification is that I can solve the wind problem you can't solve, but I'm not going to spend the next hour telling you about my resume. I'm going to show you a methodology, and then we're going to the range, and you're going to see whether it works. If it does, we continue. If it doesn't, I'll pack my bag and you can go back to your 38%. The room was quiet. Not convinced, but willing to listen, which was enough. Ava turned to the whiteboard and began teaching. She didn't make the same mistakes she had made in the assessment program. She didn't talk about how the wind felt or how the air looked thicker. She walked them through the layered wind assessment protocol step by step, using concrete terminology, numbered procedures, and visual diagrams that any trained shooter could follow. Step 1. Macro wind identification using 3 large-scale indicators. She drew examples: distant vegetation movement, broad dust patterns, cloud shadows tracking across the ground. Step 2. Flight path segmentation. Divide the distance between muzzle and target into thirds. For each third, Identify the dominant local wind effect using the most visible small-scale indicator. Step 3. Interaction classification. Adjacent layers moving in similar directions at different speeds. Compressive reduces net drift. Adjacent layers moving in different directions. Shearing creates curved bullet path requiring nonlinear correction. Step 4. Correction table application. She distributed laminated cards with the table printed on both sides. The product of weeks of refinement, tested against her own shooting data and Whitfield's improvement metrics. She kept it to 22 minutes. Then she stopped. Questions. The sergeant with the tattoo, his name was Pryor, she learned later, raised a hand. This interaction classification. Compressive versus shearing. How do you determine which one is happening when you can't see clear indicators in the mid-third? Good question. If you can't see indicators, you default to the nearest visible indicator and extrapolate based on terrain. If there's a ridge or a draw between your near third and mid-third, assume the terrain is modifying the wind. Ridge creates a shadow, wind weakens, interaction trends compressive. Draw funnels wind accelerates, interaction trends toward shearing if the draw changes direction. Pryor nodded slowly. Not agreement, processing. Cobb pushed off the wall. Range time, specialist? Range time. The first range session was controlled and deliberate. Ava had them shoot 5-round groups at 1,000 meters using their standard method, then the same distance using the protocol. She walked behind the firing line, observing each shooter's process, noting where they struggled with the new steps. Results were mixed. 8 of 15 showed marginal improvement, 4 showed no change. 3 actually performed worse. The unfamiliarity of the new process introduced hesitation that degraded their timing. Pryor was one of the 8 who improved. His standard group at 1,000 meters measured roughly 6 inches. Using the protocol, he tightened to 4.5. He pulled back from his rifle and looked at Ava standing behind him. The correction table told me to reduce my windage by 15%. My gut said hold full correction. The table was right. Your gut was reading the wind at your position. The table accounts for what happens between you and the target. So I'm supposed to trust a laminated card over 15 years of experience. You're supposed to use the card to fill in the gaps your experience can't cover. At 1,000 meters in simple terrain, your experience is probably sufficient. At 1,400 meters in a mountain valley with thermal layering, it isn't. That's where the card earns its keep. Pryor stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned back to his rifle without saying anything, which Ava had learned was operator shorthand for "I'm thinking about it." By the end of the first week, initial testing showed an average improvement of 9 percentage points across the group, from 38% hit rate at 1,200 plus meters to 47%. Modest. Not enough. But the trend line was pointing in the right direction. Cobb delivered the numbers to Briggs in a briefing that Ava attended but didn't lead. Briggs studied the data on a laptop screen, scrolling through engagement records and composite scores. 9 points in 1 week. Yes, sir, Cobb said. That puts us on pace for roughly 70% by deployment if the improvement is linear. Is it linear? Cobb glanced at Ava. She stepped forward. It won't be linear, sir. The initial improvement comes from correcting systematic errors in their current wind methodology. They're overcorrecting in certain terrain configurations, and the protocol fixes that quickly. The next phase of improvement will be harder. It requires the shooters to internalize the interaction classifications so they can apply them faster under time pressure. That's a skill-building process, not a correction, and skill-building plateaus before it accelerates. How long is the plateau? Based on my experience with one previous student. One student? Yes, sir. The protocol is new. Corporal Whitfield at the assessment program was the first person I taught it to. He plateaued in week 2, then broke through in week 3 when the classification process became automatic. Briggs looked at Cobb. She's basing deployment readiness projections on a sample size of 1. Cobb shifted his weight. Sir, the methodology is sound. I've been observing the range sessions. The shooters who are engaging with the protocol are producing better wind calls than they were producing with the standard method. The data supports that. The data supports a 9-point improvement in a controlled training environment. Deployment is not a controlled environment. No, sir, but the Blackstone engagement wasn't controlled either, and the protocol is based on the same principles that produced that result. Briggs turned to Ava. Specialist, I'm going to be direct with you. I approved this training because Wakefield recommended it and because your Blackstone performance was exceptional. But I have 16 operators preparing for a deployment where their accuracy at extreme range could determine whether hostages live or die. I need more than a promising trend line. I need confidence. Then give me the 11 weeks, sir. If the numbers aren't where they need to be by week 9, pull the plug and I'll have wasted your time. But if they are, your shooters will be capable of things they currently think are impossible. Briggs held her gaze for 5 seconds. You have until week 9. If the composite hit rate isn't above 65% at 1,200 plus meters by then, we revert to standard methodology and you go back to the assessment program. Understood, sir. And, Weeks 2 through 4 were the plateau Ava had predicted. The initial gains stabilized. Hit rates hovered around 48%, refusing to climb. The shooters were following the protocol steps: macro wind identification, segmentation, classification, but they were doing it mechanically, consulting the laminated cards like checklists instead of integrating the process into their natural shooting rhythm. The protocol was adding 10 to 15 seconds per engagement, and under time pressure, that delay cost them accuracy because they were rushing the execution to compensate for the extended setup. Ava recognized the problem because she had lived it. When Elias first taught her to read wind as a system instead of a single variable, she had gone through the same phase, consciously running through steps that needed to become unconscious before they could work at speed. The transition from deliberate process to automatic skill took repetition. Hundreds of repetitions. In conditions that varied enough to prevent rote memorization. She redesigned the training. Instead of controlled range sessions with fixed targets and ample time, she created what she called wind sprints, rapid-fire exercises where shooters had 30 seconds to assess wind, build a solution, and engage a target at a random distance between 800 and 1,500 meters. No time for the laminated card. No time for deliberate step-by-step analysis. The protocol's framework had to live in their heads, or it didn't work. The first wind sprint session was ugly. Hit rates dropped to 30%, worse than their baseline. Shooters cursed. Pryor threw his Kestrel meter 10 feet across the ground after missing 4 consecutive shots at 1,100 meters. "This is making us worse," he said, standing up from his rifle with his jaw tight. "We were better off before you showed up." Ava didn't flinch. "You were better off with more time per shot. Take away the time and your standard method falls apart just as fast as the protocol. The difference is that the protocol can be compressed. Your method can't. It requires Kestrel readings and calculator inputs that have a minimum time floor. So we're supposed to just suffer through this until it magically gets faster? It's not magic. It's the same process you went through learning CQB. First time you cleared a room, you were slow and deliberate and checking every corner step by step. Now you flow through it because the steps are automatic. Wind reading is the same skill. It just takes reps. Pryor picked up his Kestrel, wiped the dust off it, and lay back down behind his rifle without another word. By the end of week 4, something started to shift. Not in the scores, those were still stuck around 48 to 50%. In the speed. Shooters were completing their wind assessments faster. The classification step, which had initially required 10 seconds of conscious analysis, was dropping to 5, then 4. Some shooters were beginning to classify wind interactions before they consciously identified them, the early stage of automaticity that Ava had been waiting for. Week 5. The scores broke through 50%. Week 6. 58%. Week 7. 62%. Cobb started showing up to range sessions with a thermos of coffee and the expression of a man watching something he hadn't believed in start to work. He didn't say much, but his presence, the senior NCO standing behind the line, watching, taking notes, sent a message to the shooters that was worth more than any speech Ava could have given. In the evenings, Ava called the care facility. Elias's wrist was healing. His cognition was not. Darlene reported that he was having more confused episodes, longer periods where he didn't recognize his room, his nurses, or the basic architecture of his own life. But he still responded to the name Grace, and he still talked about wind. He told one of the aides today that the flags were reading 7 knots from the right, Darlene said. There aren't any flags, of course, but he was very specific about it. 7 knots. He seemed pleased with himself. Ava pressed her knuckles against her forehead and breathed through the ache. That's his standard wind call for a 300-yard match. He's remembering competitions. He's remembering something. That's more than some days. Well, week 8 brought Kilpatrick. The sergeant who had invented a dental appointment on day 1 had been participating grudgingly since week 2, following the protocol without enthusiasm, producing results that hovered near the bottom of the group. He wasn't a bad shooter. His fundamentals were solid, his trigger control was clean, but he approached the protocol with the passive resistance of someone who had decided in advance that it wouldn't work and was collecting evidence to confirm that decision. On Thursday of week 8, during a live fire exercise in gusting conditions, Kilpatrick missed 5 of 6 shots at 1,300 meters. His frustration boiled over during the debrief. "This system doesn't work for me. I've been following your steps, using your table, doing everything you've taught, and I'm shooting worse than I was before." Ava pulled his engagement data on her laptop. "You're following the steps, but you're not classifying correctly. On 4 of your 6 engagements today, you classified the mid-third interaction as compressive when the terrain clearly indicated shearing. That's why your corrections are off. You're reducing your windage when you should be adding a curved path component. How am I supposed to tell the difference when I'm lying behind a rifle in 30-knot wind trying to hit a target I can barely see? By looking at the indicators I taught you, the snow at the mid-third today was moving in a different direction than the snow at the near-third. Different direction means shearing. Same direction at different speed means compressive. You know this." "I know the definitions. I don't see it when it matters." The room was tense. 14 other shooters were watching the exchange, measuring Ava's response. She closed the laptop. "Then we train it until you do. Tomorrow morning, 06, you and me on the range. No targets, no shooting, just wind reading. I'll call what I see, you call what you see, and we figure out where the disconnect is." Kilpatrick stared at her. "A private lesson. A diagnostic session. Your fundamentals are fine. Your classification is the bottleneck. We fix the bottleneck, your scores come up. And if they don't? Then I'll tell Colonel Briggs that the protocol doesn't work for every shooter and recommend you revert to standard methods for the deployment. I'm not trying to force this on anyone, but I'm not going to let you fail without trying to help you succeed." Kilpatrick looked at the floor. Something in his posture softened. Not much, just enough to suggest that behind the resistance was a man who was frustrated with himself more than with Ava. 06, he said, and walked out. The diagnostic session the next morning lasted 3 hours. Ava and Kilpatrick lay side by side on the ridge, not shooting, just watching the valley. She had him verbally call every wind indicator he could identify: dust movement, snowdrift, mirage shimmer, vegetation lean. Then she called what she saw. The gap was in spatial processing. Kilpatrick could identify individual indicators accurately, but he struggled to mentally map them to the correct segment of the flight path. When she asked him which third a particular dust pattern corresponded to, he consistently misjudged the distance, placing near-third indicators in the mid-third zone and vice versa. "You're reading the wind correctly," Ava told him. "You're placing it incorrectly. You see a dust pattern and you know what it means, but you're assigning it to the wrong part of the bullet's path. That's why your classifications are off. You're classifying based on mismatched data." "So how do I fix it?" She thought about it. This was a problem the protocol didn't address because Ava had never experienced it. Her spatial processing was intuitive, developed over years of ranging targets with her naked eyes before she ever used a scope. Kilpatrick had spent his career looking through optics, which compress distance perception. Range the midpoint of each third with your laser before you start your wind assessment. Physically mark the distance in your head so you know exactly where the near third ends and the mid third begins. Then when you see an indicator, you can place it accurately because you have hard reference points. That adds time. It adds 3 seconds, and it eliminates the classification errors that are costing you every shot. Kilpatrick tried it on the next range session. His hit rate at 1,300 meters went from 17% to 55% in a single afternoon. He didn't thank Ava. He didn't apologize for the weeks of resistance. He walked off the range, stopped beside her, and said 4 words that carried more weight than any praise she had received in the program. "What else have you got?" Week 9. Evaluation Day. Colonel Briggs arrived at the range complex with Wakefield, who had flown in from the assessment facility to observe. The test was simple and brutal. Each of the 16 shooters would engage 10 targets at distances from 1,200 to 1,600 meters in live mountain wind conditions. Composite hit rate would determine whether the training continued or the protocol was abandoned. Ava stood behind the firing line, not shooting, just watching. This was the test she couldn't take for them, the moment where everything she had built would either hold or collapse under the weight of reality. The wind was fierce, 30-plus knots gusting to 45, with the complex layering that defined this valley. Exactly the conditions the protocol was designed for. Exactly the conditions that had produced a 38% hit rate 11 weeks ago. Shooter 1 engaged. 7 hits out of 10, 70%. Shooter 2, 6 out of 10, 60%. Shooter 3, prior, 8 out of 10, 80%. He stood up from the rifle and looked at Ava with an expression that said everything without speaking. The numbers kept coming, shooter after shooter, engaging targets at distances that had been considered unreliable 3 months ago, in conditions that would have defeated them completely before the protocol. Kilpatrick shot 14th. He lay behind his rifle, ranged his segment midpoints, ran his wind assessment, classified the interactions, and engaged 10 targets with the focused deliberation of a man who had been broken down and rebuilt. 7 hits out of 10. Not the best score of the day. Not the worst. But for a man who had been hitting 17% at 1,300 meters 3 weeks ago, it was a transformation. When the last shooter finished, Cobb tallied the composite. He checked his math twice, then handed the tablet to Briggs. Briggs looked at the number. Then he looked at Ava. 71% composite hit rate at 1,200 plus meters. The range was quiet. 3 months ago, this unit was at 38%. You've nearly doubled their effective range accuracy in 11 weeks. Ava didn't celebrate. She didn't smile. She felt the number land in her chest like a round hitting steel. The delayed impact of something she had released a long time ago, finally reaching its target. The protocol works, sir, but the shooters did the work. I just showed them where to look. Briggs closed the tablet. Wakefield, do you have what you need for her assessment? Wakefield, standing 10 feet away with his arms crossed, nodded once. Specialist Mercer has demonstrated the ability to develop original marksmanship methodology, translate intuitive expertise into teachable procedure, and produce measurable improvement in operational shooters under realistic conditions. She passes the instructor assessment. He said it the way he said everything, flat, clinical, without ceremony. But his eyes held something that his voice didn't, and Ava caught it for just a moment before he looked away. Briggs extended his hand. Ava shook it. When you're done with the assessment program, I'd like to discuss a permanent assignment with my unit. We could use what you've built. Thank you, sir. I need to think about it. Take your time, but not too much time. Deployment clock is ticking. That evening, Ava sat in her quarters with the phone in her hand, working up the nerve to call the facility. She had been putting it off all day, using the evaluation as an excuse, but the real reason was simpler and harder. She was afraid of what she might hear. Darlene answered immediately. He had a good day, Ava, a really good day. Ate all his lunch, watched a nature documentary, and pointed out the wind direction in every outdoor shot. Told the aide that the trees were reading 12 knots from the southwest. Ava laughed, a short, raw sound that caught in her throat. Was he right? I have no idea, but he was very confident about it. Darlene, I need to tell you something. I completed a major assignment today. I'm going to be reassigned, promoted probably, into a permanent instructor role. The pay increase should cover his medication. I can set up the new payment plan next week. The line was quiet for a moment. That's wonderful news, hun. He'd be so proud. Can I talk to him? He's sleeping, but I'll tell him in the morning. What should I say? Ava looked at the binder on her desk. 46 pages of methodology built from a lifetime of windy hillsides and patient instruction from a man who had given everything to a girl nobody else believed in. Tell him Grace won the match. The transport back to the assessment facility took 4 hours. Ava spent most of it staring out the window at terrain sliding beneath the aircraft. Mountains giving way to foothills, giving way to the flat, scorched expanse of the desert where everything had started. Wakefield met her at Building 7. He was holding a folder. Your assessment is complete. You've been recommended for graduation and assignment to the Advanced Marksmanship Instructor, Cadre. The recommendation includes a proposal to formally adopt the Layered Wind Assessment Protocol as a supplemental training module for Special Operations sniper programs. Ava took the folder. Inside was a single-page document, Her graduation certificate, signed by Wakefield and countersigned by two names she didn't recognize, but whose titles carried enough stars to make the paper feel heavy. There's also the matter of your rank, Wakefield said. A specialist can't hold an instructor billet in the cadre. The promotion board has been notified, and your packet is being expedited. You'll pin sergeant within 60 days. And after that? After that, you go where the Army needs you. Briggs wants you for his unit's pre-deployment training cycle. JSOC has expressed interest in having you develop a version of the protocol for their precision rifle program. And there's a request from the 75th Ranger Regiment Sniper Section for a 2-week one-reading seminar. Ava stared at the folder. 3 months ago, she had been cataloging rifle parts in an armory tent, invisible, forgotten, maintaining weapons for people who never bothered to learn her name. I need to visit my grandfather first. Wakefield nodded. You've got 10 days of leave authorized. Use them. He paused at the door. Mercer. For what it's worth, and I don't say this to many people, you surprised me. Not with the shooting. I expected that. You surprised me with the teaching. When you first stood in front of that classroom and talked about the air feeling thicker, I thought you'd wash out by week 6. I was wrong. I almost did wash out. Almost doesn't count. You adapted. That's the hardest thing to teach, and you did it on your own. He walked away, and Ava stood in the hallway holding a folder that contained the proof of everything she had fought for, feeling not triumph, but something quieter, the relief of a long-held breath finally released. She drove to the care facility on a Wednesday afternoon. It was a low, clean building surrounded by landscaped gardens in a small town she had visited 11 times in 4 years. Each visit shorter than she wanted, because leave was always limited and the drive was always long. Darlene met her at the front desk with a hug that Ava hadn't expected and didn't resist. He's in the sunroom. Fair warning, it's a mixed day. He was clear this morning but started drifting after lunch. He might know you, he might not. Ava walked down the corridor past rooms with open doors showing glimpses of other lives in various stages of leaving and pushed through the sunroom door. Elias was sitting in a wheelchair by the window, his casted left wrist resting on his lap, his right hand holding a cup of juice he wasn't drinking. He was thinner than the last time she'd seen him. His white hair, once thick and swept back with the vanity of a man who cared about appearances, was sparse and uncombed. He was staring out the window at the garden, where a row of ornamental grasses was bending in the afternoon breeze. Ava pulled a chair beside him and sat down. Hey, Grandpa. He turned his head slowly. His eyes found her face and stayed there, searching, processing. For 5 terrible seconds, she saw no recognition, just the polite confusion of a man being addressed by a stranger. Then something moved behind his eyes. A flicker. A connection firing across damaged neural pathways. Gracie? Yeah, it's me. He looked at her for a long time. His mouth worked, forming words that didn't quite arrive. Then he looked back at the window, at the grasses bending in the wind. 6 knots, he said softly. Maybe 7. From the west. Ava looked at the grasses. They were leaning gently to the east, their tips describing small arcs in the air. She estimated the wind from their movement the way he had taught her when she was 9 years old, kneeling beside him on a hillside with a .22 rifle that was almost as tall as she was. I'd say 6.5, she said. The tips are moving, but the stems aren't. Under 8 for sure. Elias smiled. It was small, fragile, and it broke her heart into pieces she would spend years trying to reassemble. You always were better at that than me, he said. She reached over and took his right hand. He let her hold it. They sat together in the sunroom while the afternoon light moved across the floor and the grasses danced in a wind that only 2 people in the room knew how to read. Ava didn't tell him about the protocol. She didn't tell him about Blackstone or the assessment program or the 16 marksmen whose careers she had changed. She didn't tell him about the promotion or the reassignment or any of the things that the world would eventually recognize. She just held his hand and watched the wind with him, because that was all they had ever needed to understand each other. And some things were too important for words. She stayed for 6 days. Every morning, Ava arrived at the sunroom before breakfast and sat with Elias while the staff brought his tray, oatmeal, sliced fruit, juice he drank in small, uncertain sips, as if he'd forgotten how swallowing worked. Some mornings he recognized her immediately. Some mornings it took 20 minutes. One morning he called her by her mother's name, and Ava gently corrected him. And he looked at her with such naked confusion that she had to leave the room for 5 minutes to collect herself in the hallway. But the wind was their constant. Every afternoon they sat by the sunroom window and read the ornamental grasses in the garden. Elias's estimates were remarkably accurate for a man whose memory was dissolving. He could still gauge wind speed within a knot or two just by watching the movement of stems and leaves. The skill lived in a part of his brain that the disease hadn't reached yet, preserved in some deep stratum of neural wiring that predated the plaques and tangles eating everything else. On the fourth day, during a moment of unusual clarity, Elias turned to her and spoke with the direct, unsentimental precision she remembered from childhood. "You're different, Gracie. Something happened. A lot happened. You're carrying yourself like you figured something out. What was it?" Ava thought about how to answer. She could tell him about the protocol, about Wakefield and Purcell and Briggs, about the 16 marksmen whose accuracy she had nearly doubled. But Elias had never cared about outcomes. He cared about process, about what you learned, not what you won. "I figured out how to teach what you taught me." His eyebrows rose, a gesture so familiar it hit her like a physical blow. "You couldn't teach it before?" "I could do it. I couldn't explain it. When I tried, it came out sounding like feelings instead of instructions." "Because it is feelings." "I know. But feelings don't transfer. I had to build a system, steps, categories, a table that approximates what you taught me to feel. It's not as good as the real thing, but it's good enough to teach." Elias was quiet for a while, watching the grasses. Then he said something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. "I never could have done that. I could shoot and I could teach you because you already had it in you. But building a system that works for people who don't have it, that's something new. That's yours, not mine." His eyes drifted back to the window, and the clarity began to fade, replaced by the soft, unfocused gaze that meant he was slipping back into wherever his mind went when the present became too heavy to hold. But the words hung in the air between them, and Ava held on to them the way she held on to everything Elias had given her, tightly, carefully, knowing the source was finite. On the 6th day, she packed her bag and stood in his room while he slept. His breathing was steady, his face slack, his casted wrist propped on a pillow. She leaned down and kissed his forehead. "I'll come back soon, Grandpa." He didn't stir. She drove back to the assessment facility with the windows down and the radio off, watching the landscape change from green to brown to the bleached nothing of the desert, thinking about systems and feelings and the distance between what you know and what you can share. Sergeant Stripes came 43 days later. The ceremony was small. Wakefield pinned the rank in his office with Orozco as witness. No formation, no parade. Ava stood at attention while Wakefield pressed the chevrons onto her collar and stepped back. "Congratulations, Sergeant Mercer." "Thank you, sir. Your first assignment as a cadre instructor begins Monday. JSOC's Precision Rifle Program wants a 2-week wind methodology course at their compound. 12 students, all experienced snipers from Tier 1 units. These aren't corporals, Mercer. These are operators with multiple deployments and very strong opinions about how they do their job." "I'm familiar with strong opinions. I know you are. That's why I'm sending you." He handed her a travel packet. She opened it, scanned the orders, and paused at the bottom of the page. "Sir, this says course director, not assistant instructor, not guest lecturer." "Correct. You're running the course, your name, your curriculum, your methodology. Orozco will accompany you as range safety officer, but the instruction is yours." Ava looked at Orozco, who was leaning against the filing cabinet with the unreadable expression she wore like armor. Orozco gave a small nod that contained neither encouragement nor warning, just acknowledgement. "One more thing," Wakefield said. "Purcell graduated the program last week. He's been assigned to the 75th Sniper Section as a senior instructor." "Good. He's a strong teacher. He asked me to pass something along to you." Wakefield opened his desk drawer and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He's not much for sentimentality, so don't expect poetry. Ava unfolded the paper. It was a printed photograph. A young girl standing at a shooting bench on an outdoor range, a scoped rifle propped beside her, her face scrunched in concentration as she stared through a spotting scope at a distant target. Written on the back in Purcell's blocky handwriting, "Her name is Megan. She's using your protocol. She hit steel at 800 yards last Saturday. DP." Ava stared at the photograph for a long time. He's teaching his daughter the protocol. Apparently so. She folded the paper carefully and put it in her breast pocket, the same pocket where she had carried the reassignment message from Blackstone, the same pocket where important things lived close to her chest. The JSOC course was everything Wakefield had warned her about, and several things he hadn't. 12 operators. All staff sergeants or above. All with combat records that would fill binders. All convinced, to varying degrees, that they already knew everything worth knowing about long-range shooting and that a freshly minted sergeant with no deployments was unlikely to change that. The first morning, Ava walked into the classroom and found 12 men who sat the way operators sat in every classroom she had ever entered, leaned back, arms crossed, radiating the particular energy of people who had been ordered to attend something they hadn't asked for. She wrote "Wind is a system" on the whiteboard. Then she turned to face them. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that you've been shooting in combat for years, and some new sergeant from an instructor program is going to tell you that you've been reading Wind wrong. That's not what I'm going to tell you. She paused. I'm going to tell you that you've been reading Wind right, for simple conditions. But the environments you're deploying into are not simple. Mountain valleys, urban canyons, complex terrain with layered wind systems that defeat standard ballistic models. In those environments, your current method gives you a 60 to 65% hit rate at extreme range. My method will give you 75 to 80. A master sergeant in the front row, a lean, weathered man with a name tape reading Shaw, uncrossed his arms. 75 to 80 at what distance? 1,200 meters and beyond, in wind above 20 knots with complex terrain interactions. And your evidence for that claim? A unit that went from 38% to 71% in 11 weeks using this methodology. I trained them personally. Briggs's people, another operator said from the back row. We heard about that. Then you know the results are real. What you don't know is how the methodology works. That's what the next 2 weeks are for. Shaw studied her. You're the one who made the Blackstone shot. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of established fact. The kind of thing that had traveled through the special operations community in the way that exceptional performances always did, passed from operator to operator until the story became part of the institutional knowledge that everyone knew but nobody discussed in official channels. I am. 15 snipers missed and you solved it from watching snow. I solved it from understanding how wind layers interact. The snow was just the indicator. Shaw nodded slowly. All right, Sergeant, you've got our attention. Don't waste it. She didn't. 2 weeks. The compressed timeline meant longer days, harder drills, faster progression through the protocol steps. Ava had refined her teaching approach through 3 previous iterations. Whitfield, the assessment cohort, Briggs's marksmen, and the accumulated experience showed. She was clearer, more structured, better at anticipating where students would struggle and addressing the problem before it calcified into frustration. The JSOC operators were faster learners than any previous group. Their fundamentals were impeccable. Their discipline was absolute, and their ability to absorb new methodology while maintaining existing skill sets was exactly what Ava would have expected from the best shooters in the military. The protocol didn't replace their training. It added a layer of wind analysis that their existing training hadn't included. By the end of week 1, range scores at 1,200 meters had increased by an average of 11 percentage points. By the end of week 2, the composite hit rate at 1,400 meters in complex wind was 78%. Shaw approached Ava on the final day, after the last evaluation was complete and the range had been cleared. He was carrying his rifle case in one hand and a small black notebook in the other, the kind of personal log that serious shooters kept throughout their careers, recording every significant engagement, every lesson learned, every piece of hard-won knowledge. I've been keeping this book for 19 years, he said. Every instructor I've trained under, every technique that changed my shooting goes in here. There are 11 entries. He opened the book and showed her the latest page, written in careful, precise handwriting. Layered Wind Assessment Protocol. Sergeant Mercer, Interaction Classification and Correction Table Methodology. First significant advancement in practical wind reading I've encountered in operational context. Your entry number 12, he said. Nobody gets in this book unless they teach me something I didn't know. You did. Ava looked at the notebook entry, at the careful handwriting of a man who had spent nearly 2 decades mastering a craft and still considered himself a student. She thought about Elias's words in the sunroom. That's something new. That's yours, not mine. And felt the quiet weight of knowing that the system she had built was becoming something larger than herself. Thank you, Master Sergeant. That means more than you know. I suspect it does. He closed the notebook. One more thing. Captain Voss, the man from Blackstone, he's been reassigned to an intelligence position at a joint command. He asked me to pass along a message if I ever met you. Ava's chest tightened. She hadn't thought about Voss in weeks. The man whose life had started everything, whose kneeling figure in the snow had been the target of her impossible shot. What's the message? He said, My daughter is 4 years old now. She exists because someone I never met decided to try when everyone else had given up. Tell her that's enough. She doesn't owe me anything else. We're even. Ava stood on the range in the afternoon heat, holding the straps of her rifle case, and let the words settle into the place where the most important things lived. She didn't cry. She wasn't a crier, never had been, and the emotional landscape of the last year had taught her that some feelings were too large for tears. They needed space, time, and silence to be fully absorbed. Tell him we were never keeping score, she said. Shaw nodded and walked away. The next 18 months moved at a pace that would have been unimaginable to the armorer who had once organized ammunition crates in an armory tent. Ava ran 7 courses, 4 for JSOC elements, 2 for Army Special Forces sniper teams, 1 for a Marine Raider battalion that had specifically requested the protocol after hearing about its results through inter-service channels. Each course refined the methodology further. The correction table was expanded, the classification system was simplified, and the teaching progression was streamlined based on accumulated student performance data. The layered wind assessment protocol was formally adopted as a supplemental training module by the Special Operations Command's Marksmanship Directorate. Ava's name was listed as the developer. The document, now 61 pages with appendices, diagrams, and reference tables, carried a classification marking that ensured it would never appear in any public database but would be distributed to every special operations sniper program in the military. Purcell called her once, 4 months after graduation, from a range at the 75th's home station. The call was brief, professional, and contained exactly the amount of personal warmth that Dale Purcell was capable of expressing, which was to say, very little, but more than zero. Megan hit at 1,000 yards last weekend. She used the full protocol, segmentation, classification, correction table, called the wind herself. No help from me. How old is she now? 15. She wants to enter a junior ELR competition this spring. Ava smiled. Tell her to shoot under her middle name. A beat of silence. Then Purcell laughed, a sound she had never heard from him before, rough and genuine. I might just do that. Take care, Mercer. You too, Dale? She hung up and sat for a moment with the phone in her hand, thinking about how the most unexpected connections were often the ones that lasted. Gallagher emailed her occasionally, short, informal updates from whatever corner of the world his assignment had taken him. He had graduated the assessment program 3rd overall and was now teaching at a facility she wasn't cleared to know about, doing work she wasn't cleared to ask about. His messages were light, dry, and always ended the same way. Still using your protocol. Still works. Still annoyed I didn't think of it first. Orozco, who had accompanied Ava on the first 3 courses as range safety officer, eventually stopped coming. Not because she wasn't needed, but because Ava had demonstrated that she could manage the range, the students, and the logistics without supervision. Their last conversation before Orozco rotated to a new assignment was characteristic of their entire relationship, short, professional, and precisely calibrated. You've gotten better, Mercer. Better at what? Everything, but especially at knowing when to shut up and let the student figure it out. That took you longer than it should have. I had a slow start. You had a terrible start. You finished strong. That's what matters. 11 months after Ava's promotion, she received a phone call at 0317 from Darlene. She knew before she answered. The tone in Darlene's voice, careful, gentle, stripped of the cheerful professionalism that usually characterized their conversations, told her everything. She sat on the edge of her bunk in her quarters at the training facility and listened to the words that she had been preparing for and dreading in equal measure for years. Elias had passed in his sleep. No pain. No distress. The night nurse had checked on him at 2 and he was breathing steadily. At 3, he wasn't. Ava thanked Darlene. She set the phone on the nightstand. She sat in the dark for 45 minutes without moving, without crying, without doing anything at all except breathing and letting the reality reshape itself around the absence of the only person who had ever seen her completely. Then she got up, dressed, and went outside. It was a clear night, no wind. The desert air was perfectly still, so still that the silence had a physical presence, filling the space between the buildings and the stars with something that felt almost solid. No wind. The one night there was no wind. Ava stood in the middle of the empty compound and looked up at the sky and felt for the first time in her life completely alone. Not lonely. She had been lonely many times in barracks and classrooms and on ridge lines where nobody knew her name. This was different. This was the specific aloneness of being the last person who carried a particular knowledge, a particular way of seeing the world that had been passed from one set of hands to another and now rested entirely in hers. Elias was gone. The man who had stood beside her on 100 hillsides and taught her to feel what the air was doing. The man who had believed in her before she believed in herself, who had hidden her identity to protect her achievements, who had given up his savings and his independence and eventually his mind without ever asking for anything in return except that she keep shooting, was gone. And she was still here. She stayed outside until dawn. When the sun broke the horizon and the first thermal currents of the day began to stir the desert air, she felt a faint breeze cross her face from the east, 2 knots, maybe 3, carrying the dry warmth of sand and distance. She read it without thinking, the way she always would. Peso. The memorial was small. Ava, Darlene, 2 aides from the facility, and Elias's younger brother, a quiet man named Harold, who had driven 9 hours from a town in the western foothills and stood at the graveside with his hands folded and his eyes dry, grieving in the private way their family had always grieved. Afterward, Harold pulled Ava aside in the parking lot. "Your grandfather left something for you. He wrote it during one of his clear spells about 6 months ago. Darlene helped him get it notarized." He handed her a manila envelope. Inside was a single page handwritten in Elias's careful script, the same handwriting she had seen on target cards and match score cards, and the index cards he used to catalog his reloading data. "Gracie, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you're still here, which is how it should be. I don't have money to leave you. I spent it all on rifles and range fees and that one trip to Wyoming where you placed second and cried in the truck because you wanted first. I remember that. I hope I still remember it when this gets bad. What I do have is this. Everything I know about wind, about shooting, about the patience it takes to wait for the right moment and the courage it takes to pull the trigger when it comes, all of that lives in you now. Not in my trophies or my rifles or any piece of paper. In you. You were always better than me. I knew it when you were 12. You just needed time to believe it. Don't waste what you have trying to prove it to people who don't matter. Use it to teach the ones who want to learn. That's how you keep it alive. I love you. Win the match. Elias." Ava read the letter 3 times in the parking lot while Harold waited beside his truck. She folded it along the existing creases, put it in her breast pocket, and drove back to the facility. She went straight to her office, a small room she had been assigned 6 months ago, with a desk, a computer, and a window that overlooked the Western Range complex. She sat down and opened the protocol binder. 61 pages. The product of everything Elias had taught her, translated into a system that could teach others. His legacy, transformed into methodology. His intuition, rendered into steps and tables and classifications that would outlive them both. She turned to the acknowledgments page, a section she had added during the last revision, but had left blank, unsure what to write. Now she knew. She picked up a pen and wrote, "For Elias Mercer, who taught me to read the wind. Everything in these pages began with him." She closed the binder and sat in the quiet office, looking out the window at the desert where heat shimmer rose from the ground in slow, wavering columns. Thermal indicators that told her the surface temperature was high, the air was unstable, and the afternoon would bring convective currents that would challenge any shooter on the range. She read all of it without effort, the way she had read it since she was 9 years old, the way she would read it for the rest of her life. 2 2 years after Blackstone, Ava Mercer stood in a new office. Not the small room at the training facility. A proper office, in a building with her name on the door, at an installation overlooking the Pacific coast where the military's Advanced Marksmanship Research Program had been headquartered for 30 years. She had been assigned here as the program's youngest ever lead instructor, a title that came with responsibilities she was still growing into and a pay grade that finally comfortably covered Elias's remaining care facility bills, which she continued to pay monthly as a donation in his name to support other residents. The office had 3 things on the wall: a framed photograph of Elias taken at a competition 20 years ago. He was standing behind a rifle on a bench rest, squinting through the scope, his face creased with concentration. In the background, wind flags were flying at the 20-degree angle that indicated a 7-knot crosswind. Ava had found the photograph in a box of his belongings that Harold had shipped to her after the memorial. A printed photograph of a little girl, Voss's daughter, whose name was Lily. Voss had sent the picture through Shaw, along with a note that said simply, "This is what you saved." The girl was sitting on a swing, laughing at something outside the frame, completely unaware that her existence was the downstream consequence of a single bullet fired through frozen mountain air by a woman she would probably never meet, and a small brass plaque mounted on a wooden base that read, "In recognition of extraordinary marksmanship under combat conditions, Blackstone Highlands Operation." It had arrived in a padded envelope with no return address and no accompanying letter, just the plaque and a note card with a single line in handwriting she recognized as Harlow's. "You earned this. D.H." Ava sat at her desk and opened her laptop. She had a course to prepare, a new iteration of the layered wind assessment protocol, expanded to include urban wind channeling effects that her latest research had identified. 3 classes were scheduled for the coming quarter, with students from 4 different branches of the military and 2 allied nations. The protocol had grown beyond her. It was being taught at 6 installations, referenced in 3 doctrinal publications, and studied by marksmanship programs in countries she had never visited. The correction table had been validated across 12 different terrain types by independent evaluators who confirmed its effectiveness. The classification system had been simplified twice based on student feedback, making it accessible to shooters who would never develop Ava's intuitive wind reading, but could still produce significantly better results than conventional methods allowed. She had built something that would outlast her career, something that took what one old man had spent a lifetime learning and made it available to anyone willing to do the work. That was enough. Not fame. She still didn't want that, and the classified nature of most of her work ensured she wouldn't get it. Not recognition. The plaque on the wall and the entries in Shaw's notebook and the photograph of a laughing girl on a swing were all the recognition she needed. Just the knowledge that she had been given a gift and she had found a way to pass it on. Outside her window, the Pacific wind was coming in from the northwest at 12 knots, carrying salt air and the distant sound of waves breaking against the rocks below the installation. She could see it in the way the coastal grasses leaned, in the pattern of ripples on the surface of a retention pond near the parking lot, in the direction of a flag flying from a pole near the main gate. She read it all, automatically, completely, the way Elias had taught her, the way she would teach others again and again, for as long as the wind kept blowing and someone was willing to learn. Ava Mercer had never wanted to be famous. She never wanted medals or ceremonies or her name in headlines. She only wanted what she had always wanted, from the first afternoon on a windy hillside with a grandfather who saw something in her that nobody else bothered to look for, the chance to prove what she could do. And she did. Sometimes the world doesn't overlook talent because it's hidden. It overlooks talent because it never bothered to look.